An intense confrontation scene in a suburban neighborhood. A white elderly woman wearing an orange sweater is angrily shouting at a muscular black man in a blue shirt, who is yelling back. In the background, a police officer in a blue uniform stands between them, looking concerned and ready to intervene. The setting is outside a house with a white picket fence, colorful flowers, and a neatly trimmed lawn. The lighting is natural and bright, and the atmosphere is tense, capturing the emotional intensity of the moment in a realistic style. What would you do in Margaret's shoes? Comment below with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that explore the power of change, connection, and transformation. Stay tuned to find out how Margaret's story unfolds. Margaret Spencer was not the kind of person who enjoyed surprises. At 55, she had settled into a life of routine and comfort, and any disruption to her carefully organized world made her uneasy. She lived alone in a tidy white house with blue shutters, surrounded by a garden she meticulously tended each morning. Every day was predictable: wake up at 600 a.m., tend to her flowers, and enjoy a quiet breakfast with her morning tea. It wasn't glamorous, but it was the life she had built after losing her husband 5 years ago. Margaret's best friend, Doris Harris, lived just down the street. The two women often shared tea and conversations about the neighborhood, always keeping a watchful eye on any changes happening in their suburban enclave. Margaret valued her friendship with Doris, although lately she found Doris' comments about the changing neighborhood unsettling. Doris had become particularly vocal about newcomers, and how they were, in her words, ruining the character of the place. One morning, as Margaret sat on her front porch sipping tea, she noticed something new. The house next door, which had been on the market for months, was finally sold. A moving truck was parked out front, and a sleek black SUV pulled in behind it. Margaret's curiosity piqued. She had been wondering who would move in. Margaret watched closely as the new neighbors stepped out of the SUV. A tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 40s with dark skin got out of the driver's seat. He smiled warmly as he opened the passenger door for a woman who appeared to be his wife. She was slender, with long black hair, and wore a bright yellow dress. Two young boys, no older than 9, burst from the back seat, laughing and tumbling over each other in their excitement. Margaret's smile faded as she took in the scene. Something about the new neighbors made her uncomfortable. Maybe it was how different they seemed from the people she had grown used to seeing in her neighborhood. Or perhaps it was how much noise the boys were already making as they chased each other around the yard. Her peaceful morning suddenly seemed threatened by the boisterous newcomers. As if on cue, Doris arrived for their daily tea. She spotted the new family immediately, her face tightening into a frown. "Well, look who's moved in," Doris muttered as she sat down beside Margaret. "I heard from the realtor they've got a big family. Lots of kids. This neighborhood is going to the dogs." Margaret shifted uncomfortably. "I'm sure they're fine," she said, though her own feelings of unease matched Doris. "They'll be noisy, mark my words," Doris continued. "And people like that don't understand how things work around here. I hope they keep their lawn tidy at least." Margaret didn't respond. Instead, she watched as the family began unpacking, the boys' laughter cutting through the quiet of the street. A knot formed in her stomach. This wasn't the peaceful life she had imagined for herself. She didn't know these people, but already she felt uneasy about them. Over the next few days, Margaret's unease grew. The new family, the Harpers, she learned from the realtor, seemed friendly enough, but the noise from the children playing outside grated on her nerves. Tyler and Jordan Harper, the twin boys, were always outside, kicking a soccer ball or playing basketball in the driveway. Margaret could hear their laughter and shouts through her kitchen window as she tried to enjoy her quiet mornings. Doris' words echoed in her mind, fueling her discomfort. "People like that don't understand our way of life," Doris had said. And though Margaret wasn't sure exactly what Doris meant, she found herself agreeing. The Harpers were different from her other neighbors, and Margaret didn't like change. One afternoon, while Margaret was trimming her rose bushes, the boys' basketball rolled into her yard. Before she could react, Tyler ran after it, his sneakers skidding on her perfectly manicured grass. "Hey, watch it," Margaret snapped, startling the boy. Tyler froze, wide-eyed, before quickly grabbing the ball and running back to his driveway without a word. Margaret's heart raced, a mix of anger and guilt surging through her. She hadn't meant to be so harsh, but the sight of the ball rolling across her yard had triggered something in her. This was her space, her sanctuary, and she didn't like the feeling of it being disrupted. Later that day, Margaret shared the incident with Doris over tea. "You see," Doris said, shaking her head, "that's exactly what I was talking about. They don't respect boundaries. We have to keep an eye on them." Margaret nodded, though a part of her felt uneasy about the whole situation. She didn't like conflict, but she also didn't want to lose control of her peaceful world. Margaret's discomfort with the Harpers grew with each passing day. The once peaceful mornings in her garden were now filled with the sound of basketballs bouncing and children laughing. The twins, Tyler and Jordan, seemed to be outside all the time, playing their games without a care in the world. To Margaret it felt like her quiet life was being invaded, little by little. One Saturday afternoon, Margaret sat on her porch, watching the boys as they raced around their yard. They were laughing and chasing each other, their voices carrying across the neighborhood. Margaret sipped her tea, her hands tightening around the cup. She had worked so hard to create a peaceful space for herself, and now it seemed as though it was slipping away. Doris arrived for their usual tea, and as soon as she sat down, she noticed the boys. "Just listen to that racket," Doris muttered, shaking her head. "I don't know how you stand it, Margaret." Margaret sighed. "I try to ignore it, but it's hard. They're so loud." Doris leaned in conspiratorially. "You know, I wouldn't be surprised if this neighborhood starts going downhill with them here. That's how it always happens. They move in, and everything changes." Margaret frowned. "Who's they?" Doris hesitated for a moment before answering. "People who don't know how to respect the way things are done around here. They bring their noise, their chaos, and they don't care about the community. You'll see things will change, and not for the better." Margaret didn't respond, but she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling Doris' words stirred inside her. She had never thought of herself as prejudiced, but Doris' comments made sense in a way. The Harpers were different. They didn't fit into the quiet, orderly world Margaret had built for herself, and that made her anxious. Over the next few days, Margaret became more fixated on the Harpers. She watched them from her window, noting every little thing that bothered her, the way the boys ran through their yard, their laughter echoing down the street, the occasional basketball bouncing too close to her property line. Margaret found herself growing more irritated with each passing day. One evening, just as the sun was setting, Margaret noticed the boys playing basketball in their driveway. As usual, their laughter filled the air. She watched as the basketball bounced toward her yard, rolling to a stop just a few feet from her prized rose bushes. Tyler ran after the ball, his sneakers skidding on the grass as he grabbed it and ran back to the driveway. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. That was the final straw. The next morning, as Margaret stood at her kitchen window sipping her tea, she saw the Harpers getting ready for the day. David Harper was loading his car, and Rachel was helping the boys with their backpacks. Margaret felt a surge of frustration. They were loud, disruptive, and now they were invading her space. Something had to be done. Later that day, Margaret confided in Doris. "I'm thinking about calling the police," she said quietly. Doris' eyes widened. "The police? What for?" Margaret hesitated. "The noise. The boys are always playing right near my property, and it's getting out of hand. I don't feel safe." Doris nodded approvingly. "You're doing the right thing, Margaret. We have to protect our neighborhood." That afternoon, when the boys were playing basketball again, Margaret made her decision. She picked up the phone and called the non-emergency police line. "Hello, I'd like to report a disturbance," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "There are children playing very loudly near my property, and I'm concerned about my safety." The operator on the other end assured her that officers would be sent to check on the situation. Margaret sat by her window, her hands trembling. She hadn't wanted it to come to this, but she felt she had no choice. She couldn't live with the constant noise, the disruption to her peaceful life. It wasn't long before she saw a police car pull up to the Harpers' house. Margaret watched as two officers got out of the car and approached the family. Her heart pounded in her chest as she saw David Harper step out to greet them. The officers spoke with him for a few minutes, then left. Margaret could see the confusion on David's face as he watched the police car drive away. Later that evening, there was a knock at Margaret's door. She opened it to find David Harper standing on her porch. He looked calm, but Margaret could sense the tension in his posture. "Mrs. Spencer," David began, his voice steady but firm. "I understand you called the police about my sons playing outside." Margaret felt her face flush. She hadn't expected this confrontation, and suddenly she didn't feel as confident as she had earlier. Yes, I did," she stammered. "They were being very loud, and I didn't feel safe." David's eyes softened slightly. "I'm sorry if the noise bothered you, Mrs. Spencer, but I want you to know that my sons were playing in our yard, not on your property. They weren't causing any harm." Margaret didn't know how to respond. She had assumed the boys were out of control, but hearing David speak so calmly made her feel foolish. Still, she didn't want to admit she had overreacted. "I have a right to call the police if I feel threatened," she said defensively. David nodded. "Of course you do. But I'd appreciate it if you would come to me first if there's ever a problem. We're neighbors after all. Margaret felt a pang of guilt as David turned and walked back to his house. She watched him go, her chest tight with a mixture of shame and frustration. Had she really been threatened by two young boys playing in their own yard? Or was it something else that had made her so uncomfortable? As the days passed, Margaret found herself avoiding eye contact with the Harpers. She still felt uneasy about them, but the encounter with David had shaken her. She couldn't deny that he had been reasonable, even kind in his response, and yet she still felt a deep sense of discomfort about their presence in her neighborhood. Doris continued to stoke the fire, reminding Margaret of how things would change now that the Harpers were here. But Margaret wasn't so sure anymore. A small voice inside her whispered that perhaps she had been too quick to judge. Maybe she had let her fear of change cloud her judgment. One evening, as Margaret sat on her porch, she saw David playing basketball with his sons in the driveway. They were laughing and talking, their voices carrying on the warm evening breeze. Margaret watched them for a while, feeling a strange mix of emotions, frustration, guilt, and something she couldn't quite name. For the first time in weeks, Margaret didn't feel angry about the noise. Instead, she felt a pang of something deeper, something that unsettled her in a different way. She realized she wasn't just watching her neighbors anymore, she was watching a family that seemed so full of life and joy, something that had been missing from her own life for a long time. A week passed since Margaret had called the police on the Harpers, but the event still weighed heavily on her mind. She hadn't expected David Harper to confront her so calmly, nor had she anticipated the gnawing guilt that had followed. Despite her initial frustration, something about that interaction stayed with her, the way David had spoken to her with respect, how he hadn't raised his voice or been aggressive. It left her feeling conflicted, as if a veil had been lifted and she was seeing the situation through new eyes. Doris, of course, had a different reaction. "You did the right thing," she had told Margaret over tea a few days later. "People like that need to understand we won't put up with noise and disorder. This is our neighborhood, after all." Margaret had nodded, but the words didn't sit right with her. Lately, Doris' opinions felt more like an echo chamber of her own fears. Still, Margaret couldn't bring herself to fully disagree. A part of her still clung to the idea that the Harpers were somehow a threat to her peaceful life. One Saturday morning, Margaret decided to tend to her garden, hoping the familiar task would settle her mind. The weather was perfect, sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting a warm glow over her prized rose bushes. She had spent years cultivating her garden, and it was one of the few things that still brought her genuine peace. She moved slowly, bending to prune the roses when her foot caught on one of the decorative stepping stones that lined her garden. Before she knew it, she lost her balance and fell hard onto the ground. Pain shot through her hip and back as she lay there, gasping for breath. Margaret tried to push herself up, but the pain was too much. Her heart raced as she realized she couldn't move. "Help!" she called out, her voice weak. Panic set in as she lay helpless, her body aching and her mind swirling with fear. For what felt like hours, she lay there, unable to move, wondering if anyone would hear her. The thought of being stuck in her garden alone filled her with dread. She closed her eyes, her mind drifting between pain and exhaustion, when suddenly she heard voices, young voices. "Did you hear that? I think someone's calling for help," one of the voices said. Margaret's eyes flew open. She recognized the voice as belonging to one of the Harper boys. Her heart pounded, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from a strange mix of relief and shame. "Over here," she croaked, her voice barely a whisper. Moments later, two young faces peered over the fence. Tyler and Jordan's eyes widened as they spotted Margaret lying on the ground. "Mrs. Spencer," Tyler shouted, rushing to the gate. "Are you okay?" Margaret tried to respond, but the pain made it difficult to speak. The boys ran into the yard, their sneakers kicking up dirt as they hurried to her side. "We need to get help," Jordan said urgently. "You'll go get Mom and Dad," Tyler replied, sprinting toward their house. Within minutes, David and Rachel Harper were by her side, their faces filled with concern. "Mrs. Spencer, are you all right?" Rachel asked gently as she knelt beside Margaret, her hand resting on Margaret's arm. I fell," Margaret stammered, her voice trembling. "I can't get up." David's face was calm but focused. "Don't worry, we're going to get you some help. I'll call an ambulance." As David made the call, Rachel stayed with Margaret, speaking softly to her, and making sure she was as comfortable as possible. The boys hovered nearby, their expressions filled with worry. Margaret lay there, overwhelmed by the situation. The people she had viewed with suspicion and fear for weeks were now the ones helping her in her time of need. Her mind raced, and she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of shame. She had been so quick to judge them, to assume the worst, and now here they were, showing her kindness without hesitation. The ambulance arrived quickly and the paramedics carefully lifted Margaret onto a stretcher. As they prepared to take her to the hospital, she glanced up at the Harpers who were standing nearby, watching her with concern. "Thank you," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. Rachel smiled kindly. "We're just glad you're okay." Margaret's heart ached with gratitude and guilt. As the ambulance doors closed, leaving her with plenty of time to reflect during the ride to the hospital. The hospital stay was short, but it gave Margaret ample time to think. Lying in the sterile, quiet room, her mind replayed the events of the fall. She couldn't shake the image of the Harpers rushing to her side, their faces full of concern. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how wrong she had been. The Harpers weren't the problem, her own fears and prejudices were. When she returned home a few days later, Margaret felt like a different person. The garden she had once taken so much pride in now seemed less important compared to the kindness she had experienced. The roses were beautiful, but they couldn't comfort her the way the Harper family had. Doris came to visit not long after Margaret returned, and as usual she had plenty to say. "I heard about your fall," Doris said, settling into a chair in Margaret's living room. "Thank goodness those boys were around. Though I have to say, I still don't trust them. You never know what people like that might do." Margaret flinched at the words. "What do you mean, people like that?" Doris raised an eyebrow. "You know what I mean, Margaret. They're not like us. It's only a matter of time before things start to go wrong." Margaret felt a surge of anger. For weeks she had allowed Doris' words to influence her, to stoke her fears. But now, something had shifted inside her. "They saved me, Doris," Margaret said, her voice firm. "If it weren't for them, I don't know what would have happened." "They're good people," Doris scoffed. "Good people. We'll see how long that lasts. Just wait until property values drop, or they start causing real trouble." Margaret shook her head, her frustration growing. "I think you're wrong about them. I was wrong too. They're just a family trying to live their lives, and I was too caught up in my own fears to see that." Doris stared at her, clearly shocked by the change in Margaret's tone. "Margaret, are you saying you're on their side now?" "I'm on the side of what's right," Margaret replied, her voice steady. "And what I've been doing, what we've been doing, has been wrong. I won't be a part of it anymore." Doris stood abruptly, her face flushed with anger. "I can't believe what I'm hearing. After everything we've talked about, you're just going to turn your back on your own people." Margaret felt a pang of sadness as she realized the friendship she had relied on for so long was crumbling. But deep down, she knew this was the right thing to do. "I'm not turning my back on anyone," Margaret said quietly. "I'm just choosing to see people for who they really are, not who we assume they are." Doris didn't respond. She simply turned and walked out the door, leaving Margaret standing alone in her living room. For the first time in weeks, Margaret didn't feel conflicted. She felt free. The days following Margaret's confrontation with Doris were quiet, but not in the way Margaret had once craved. The absence of Doris' daily visits left a void in her life, but it was a void Margaret knew she had to face. She had spent too many years building a world based on fear, fear of change, fear of others, fear of losing control. But now, for the first time, she was beginning to see things clearly. Margaret's recovery from the fall was slow. She was still able to move around, but tending to her garden had become more difficult, and she found herself sitting on the porch more often, simply watching the world around her. The once annoying sounds of children playing now seemed like the simple joys of life sounds that had been missing from her own world for far too long. One afternoon, as she sat on her porch, she watched the Harpers in their yard. David was playing basketball with Tyler and Jordan, laughing as he tried to block their shots. Rachel sat nearby reading a book, her face lit up by the warm sunlight. Margaret felt a strange sense of longing as she watched them. It wasn't jealousy exactly, but it was something close. She realized that what she saw in the Harper family was something she had lost: a sense of connection, of family, of belonging. Margaret sighed and leaned back in her chair, letting the warm breeze wash over her. She wasn't sure what to do next, but she knew she couldn't go back to the way things were. She had spent too many years isolated, letting her fears dictate her actions. Now, after everything that had happened, she couldn't ignore the truth any longer. The Harpers were not the enemy. They were just a family, like any other, trying to live their lives. Later that day, Margaret made a decision. She would go over to the Harpers' house and apologize. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental to her. She had spent so much time avoiding them, judging them from a distance, that the thought of crossing the street and knocking on their door filled her with both dread and determination. Margaret stood in front of the mirror, smoothing down her blouse and taking a deep breath. You can do this, she told herself. With one final glance at her reflection, she grabbed a small basket of homemade cookies she had baked earlier and headed out the door. The walk across the street felt longer than it was. With each step, Margaret's heart raced, and her palms grew sweaty as she approached the Harper house. What if they didn't want to talk to her? What if they were still upset about the police incident? What if they didn't forgive her? But Margaret pushed those thoughts aside. She knew that she had to do this, not just for them, but for herself. When she reached the door, she hesitated for a moment, gathering her courage, then knocked. The door opened almost immediately, and Rachel Harper stood there, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw Margaret. "Mrs. Spencer," Rachel said, her voice cautious but not unkind. "How can I help you?" Margaret swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her nerves. "Hello, Mrs. Harper. I wanted to come by and apologize for the way I've acted. I've been wrong about a lot of things. I let my fears get the better of me, and I didn't give you or your family a fair chance." Rachel's expression softened, and she stepped aside. "Would you like to come in?" Margaret nodded, grateful for the invitation. She stepped inside the Harper home, feeling a little out of place but determined to follow through with her apology. The house was warm and inviting, filled with the sounds of the boys playing in the backyard, and the scent of something delicious cooking in the kitchen. It was a home that radiated love and comfort, everything Margaret's house had once been, but no longer was. Rachel led her to the living room, where David sat reading a newspaper. When he saw Margaret, he stood up, his expression one of polite surprise. "Mrs. Spencer," David said, setting the paper down. "This is a surprise." Margaret smiled nervously. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I wanted to come by and apologize. I've been unfair to you and your family, and I realize now that I was wrong. I've let my fears and prejudices control me for too long, and I'm truly sorry for the way I've treated you." David glanced at Rachel, then back at Margaret. There was a long pause, and Margaret felt her heart pounding in her chest, waiting for their response. Finally, David smiled. "Thank you, Mrs. Spencer. I appreciate you coming over to say that. It takes a lot of courage to admit when we're wrong." Rachel nodded in agreement. "We all make mistakes, but it's how we move forward that matters." Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her. She hadn't expected them to be so gracious, and their kindness only made her feel more ashamed of her past behavior. "I brought these," Margaret said, holding out the basket of cookies. "It's not much, but I thought it might be a way to start over." Rachel accepted the basket with a warm smile. "Thank you. That's very kind of you." For the next hour, Margaret stayed with the Harpers, chatting about everything from gardening to the neighborhood to the boys' school activities. She felt more at ease than she had in a long time, and as the conversation flowed, Margaret began to realize how much she had missed out on by keeping to herself all these years. At one point, Tyler and Jordan came inside, their faces lighting up when they saw Margaret. "Hi, Mrs. Spencer," Tyler said with a big grin. "Are you feeling better?" Margaret smiled, touched by the boy's concern. "Yes, thank you. I'm feeling much better." Jordan nodded. "We were really worried about you." Margaret's heart swelled with gratitude. "I was lucky to have such great neighbors looking out for me." As the afternoon wore on, Margaret felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had taken the first step toward healing the rift she had created, and in doing so, she had found a new sense of connection with the people she had once viewed with suspicion. The Harpers were not the intruders she had feared. They were her neighbors, and perhaps even her friends. Margaret left the Harper house that day feeling lighter than she had in years. The weight of her guilt and prejudice had been lifted, replaced by a sense of hope and possibility. She had taken the first step, but she knew there was still more work to be done. Later that week, Margaret decided to host a small neighborhood gathering, inviting the Harpers and a few other neighbors to her backyard for an afternoon of tea and conversation. It was her way of extending an olive branch, not just to the Harpers, but to the entire community. At first, Margaret wasn't sure how many people would show up, but to her surprise, nearly the entire neighborhood came. Even Doris, who had been distant since their argument, showed up, though she kept to herself for most of the event. The Harpers arrived with a homemade dish, and as the afternoon went on, Margaret found herself laughing and chatting with people she hadn't spoken to in years. The tension that had once filled her interactions with the neighborhood began to melt away, replaced by a sense of warmth and camaraderie. Margaret noticed Doris standing off to the side, watching the Harpers with a guarded expression. For a moment, Margaret felt a pang of sadness for her old friend. Doris was still trapped in the same mindset that Margaret had just escaped from, and it hurt to see someone she cared about unable to move forward. Margaret approached Doris, offering her a cup of tea. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. Doris glanced at the cup, then at Margaret. "I'm just here to see what all the fuss is about," she said, her tone clipped. Margaret sighed. "You know, Doris, it's never too late to change. I was wrong about the Harpers, and I think you'll find they're just like the rest of us." Doris didn't respond, but Margaret could see the hesitation in her eyes. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope for her old friend after all. As the days passed, Margaret's connection with the Harpers deepened. She had gone from fearing them as outsiders to welcoming them as part of her life, and she found herself looking forward to their daily interactions. Whenever she saw David or Rachel outside, she would wave, and they would often stop to chat for a few minutes. The boys, Tyler and Jordan, frequently ran over to show her their latest sports achievements or ask her about her flowers. For the first time in years, Margaret didn't feel so alone. One Saturday morning, Margaret sat on her porch enjoying the warm spring air. The garden, which had once been her refuge from the world, now felt like a shared space, a place where she could connect with her neighbors. The roses were blooming beautifully, and Margaret found herself thinking about how different her life had become in just a few short months. The doorbell rang, pulling Margaret from her thoughts. She stood up slowly, still feeling the lingering aches from her fall, and made her way to the door. When she opened it, she was surprised to see Rachel standing there holding a small bouquet of flowers. "Good morning, Mrs. Spencer," Rachel said with a warm smile. "I just wanted to bring you these as a thank you for the lovely tea party last week. We had such a wonderful time." Margaret's heart swelled at the gesture. "Oh, Rachel, that's so thoughtful of you." "Thank you." Rachel handed her the flowers. "We've really enjoyed getting to know you better. The boys talk about you all the time. You've become quite the role model for them." Margaret chuckled softly. "I'm not sure about that, but I do enjoy their company. They remind me of my own children when they were young." Rachel's expression softened. "I know you've been through a lot, Margaret. Losing your husband, your children moving away, it must have been hard. I just want you to know that if you ever need anything, we're here for you. You're part of our community now." Margaret felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "That means more to me than you know," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I've spent so long pushing people away, but now I see how much I've missed out on." Rachel nodded. "It's never too late to open your heart." They stood there for a moment, the warmth of the sun and the comfort of newfound friendship wrapping around them like a blanket. Margaret realized that her world had expanded in ways she hadn't thought possible. The Harpers had become more than just neighbors. They were her friends, her community, her family. The summer months passed peacefully, with Margaret growing closer to the Harpers and even rekindling some old friendships with other neighbors. The tension that had once gripped the neighborhood seemed to have faded, replaced by a sense of togetherness that Margaret hadn't felt in years. One day David Harper approached Margaret with a proposal. "We're organizing a neighborhood community event next month," he said. "It's going to be a potluck picnic in the park, and we thought it would be great if you could help organize it. You're one of the most experienced people in the neighborhood, after all." Margaret smiled, feeling a flutter of excitement. "I'd love to help." "It sounds like a wonderful idea." David nodded. "We want this to be an opportunity for everyone to come together, get to know each other better. I think it'll be good for the neighborhood." As they discussed the details of the event, Margaret felt a renewed sense of purpose. She hadn't realized how much she had missed being involved in her community. And now, with David's encouragement, she was ready to take a more active role in making the neighborhood a better place. Over the next few weeks, Margaret worked closely with the Harpers and other neighbors to plan the event. She spent hours on the phone, coordinating food, setting up activities, and making sure everything would run smoothly. It was exhausting work, but it was also deeply rewarding. Margaret felt like she was part of something bigger than herself, something that could bring real change to the community. The day of the picnic arrived, and the park was filled with the sounds of laughter, music, and the clinking of dishes as neighbors shared food and stories. Margaret walked through the park, greeting people and checking in to make sure everything was going well. She felt a sense of pride as she watched the neighborhood come together. At one point, she spotted Doris standing near one of the food tables, looking a little lost. Margaret hesitated for a moment before deciding to approach her. "Doris," she said gently, "I'm glad you came." Doris looked up, her face softening just a little. "I wasn't sure if I should. It feels different." Margaret nodded. "It is different. But it's a good kind of different." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the children run around the playground, their laughter filling the air. "I've been thinking," Doris said quietly. "Maybe I've been wrong. About a lot of things." Margaret turned to her, surprised but hopeful. "It's never too late to change, Doris. I've learned that myself." Doris gave a small, hesitant smile. Maybe we can all learn something from this. Margaret smiled back, feeling a flicker of hope for her old friend. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a start. And that was all Margaret could ask for. As the sun began to set, the picnic slowly wound down. Margaret sat on a bench, watching the last few families pack up their belongings. She felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that she had been part of something that brought people together. The Harpers came over to say goodbye, the boys still full of energy despite the long day. "Thank you for everything, Mrs. Spencer," Rachel said, giving her a hug. "This event wouldn't have been the same without you." Margaret smiled. "I'm just glad to be a part of it." David nodded. "You've done more than just help with the event, Margaret. You've brought the neighborhood together. We're all better for it." As Margaret sat there watching the Harpers walk away, she realized just how much her life had changed. The fears and prejudices that had once controlled her were gone, replaced by a sense of connection and belonging that she hadn't felt in years. She had come a long way from the woman who had called the police on her neighbors simply because they were different. Now Margaret saw the beauty in that difference. She saw the value of community, of friendship, of opening her heart to others. For the first time in a long time, Margaret felt truly at home. As Margaret sat on the bench, watching the last rays of the sun disappear behind the trees, she felt a deep sense of contentment. The neighborhood was quiet again, but this time the silence wasn't lonely. It was the peaceful hum of a community united. She smiled, thinking about how much her life had changed, how much she had changed. The fear, the isolation, the prejudice, it had all been replaced by something far more valuable: connection, understanding, and friendship. Margaret stood up, ready to head home for the evening. Before she left, she turned back to look at the park, now empty but filled with the memories of the day. She knew that life would never be the same, and for the first time in years, she was grateful for that. If you've enjoyed this story of transformation, connection, and the power of community, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Stay tuned for more stories that inspire and challenge the way we see the world around us. Let's keep building bridges together. John remained silent, his eyes locked on Davis' face, waiting. Davis swallowed hard, his hands shaking slightly as he spoke. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted to say that I'm sorry. I know that what I did to Lily was wrong, there's no excuse for it. I let my anger get the better of me, and I hurt a child." "Your child?" John's jaw tightened, his fists clenching under the table. He could feel the anger rising inside him again, but he forced himself to stay calm. "You didn't just hurt her," he said, his voice low. "You broke her trust. You took away a piece of her innocence. And for what? Because you were having a bad day." Davis looked down at the table, his voice thick with emotion. "I wish I could take it back. I've spent every day since it happened replaying it in my head, trying to understand why I did it. But I can't. I can't undo it." John leaned forward, his voice trembling with barely restrained fury. "No, you can't. And you have to live with that for the rest of your life. Just like Lily will have to live with what you did to her." Davis nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "I know. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make amends. I don't want to be that man anymore. I want to change." John's heart pounded in his chest as he listened. Part of him wanted to lash out, to tell Davis that no amount of apologies would ever make up for what he had done. But another part of him, the part that had always believed in justice and redemption, felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Davis could change. Maybe there was a chance for him to find a way to make things right, not just with Lily, but with himself. The meeting ended with no resolution, just a promise from Davis that he would continue to work toward making amends. John left the coffee shop feeling conflicted. He wasn't sure if he could ever forgive Davis, but he also knew that holding on to the anger wasn't helping him or his family. When he returned home, Lily was awake, sitting at the kitchen table with Carla. She looked up when she saw him, her eyes questioning. "Did you see him?" she asked softly. John nodded, sitting down beside her. "I did." Lily's hands fidgeted in her lap. "Did he say he was sorry?" John reached out, taking her small hand in his. "He did. He said he was sorry, and that he wants to make things right." Lily was quiet for a long moment, her eyes downcast. "Do you think he means it?" John paused, considering his answer carefully. "I think he does. But it's going to take time for him to prove that he's changed." Lily nodded, her expression thoughtful. Then, to John's surprise, she spoke again. "I don't want to hate him." John's heart ached at her words. "You don't have to hate him, sweetheart. What he did was wrong, but that doesn't mean you have to carry that hate with you." Lily looked up at her father, her eyes filled with a maturity that seemed beyond her years. "I wrote him a letter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I told him how much he hurt me. But I also told him that I don't want to stay angry forever. I just want to be happy again. John felt tears well up in his eyes as he listened to his daughter. You are so strong, Lily. Stronger than he'll ever be. Lily smiled faintly, though the pain of the past few weeks was still evident on her face. I just want things to be okay again. John nodded, pulling her into a tight embrace. They will be, baby. They will be. As the weeks passed, Davis began his journey toward redemption. He reached out to community leaders and offered to volunteer at local events, hoping to rebuild some of the trust he had lost. At first, the community was wary of him, unsure of his intentions. People kept their distance, watching him closely for any sign that he hadn't really changed. But Davis kept showing up. He worked hard, helping with food drives, community cleanups, and other initiatives. Slowly, the walls people had built around him began to crack. Some were willing to give him a second chance, though they remained cautious. Others were still skeptical, unsure if they could ever truly trust him again. One day, as Davis was helping set up tables at a community event, he glanced up and saw Lily standing a short distance away, watching him. Her expression was unreadable, but her presence alone felt like a small victory. Taking a deep breath, Davis walked over to her, his heart pounding in his chest. Lily, he said softly, stopping a few feet away. Lily looked up at him, her eyes steady. For a moment they stood in silence, the weight of everything that had happened hanging between them. Then, to Davis' surprise, Lily reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of folded paper. This is the letter I wrote you, she said, her voice quiet but firm. I want you to read it again. Davis took the letter with trembling hands, unfolding it slowly. He read Lily's words carefully, each sentence hitting him with the force of a tidal wave. She had written about the pain he had caused her, the fear she had felt, but also about her desire to move past it. She didn't want to be angry forever. She didn't want to carry the weight of what he had done with her for the rest of her life. When he finished reading, Davis looked up at Lily, his eyes filled with tears. Thank you, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for giving me this chance. Lily didn't say anything, but she gave him a small nod before turning and walking back to her parents. Davis watched her go, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He knew that this was just the beginning, that earning back the trust he had lost would take time, effort, and a lot of soul-searching. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. The days following Lily's decision to give Officer Davis her letter were quiet, but filled with subtle changes. John Parker noticed the shift in his daughter's small, but significant. Lily's laughter was beginning to return, though it was more hesitant now, a little more careful. She spent more time with her friends, Mia and Sophie, who had stood by her through the entire ordeal, helping her slowly return to some sense of normalcy. John, too, felt a change in himself. After hearing Davis' apology and witnessing his genuine effort to make amends, the seething anger that had lived in John's chest since the incident began to fade. It wasn't gone completely. He doubted it ever would be, but it was less consuming now, replaced by something he hadn't expected, a cautious hope. One afternoon, as John and Carla sat on their front porch, watching Lily and her friends play in the yard, John broke the silence that had settled between them. She's getting better, John said quietly, his eyes following Lily as she wheeled herself through the grass, laughing at something Mia had said. Carla nodded, smiling softly. She's resilient. But that doesn't mean she isn't still hurting. John sighed, leaning back in his chair. I know. I just hope. I hope we're doing the right thing by letting her see Davis again. Carla turned to look at him, her gaze steady. It's what she wanted, and maybe it's what she needed. Holding on to that anger, it's not good for anyone. Not for her, not for us. John rubbed his hands together, his thoughts drifting back to the coffee shop meeting. I just never thought I'd be in a position where I'd have to even consider forgiving someone for something like this. Carla reached over and took his hand, her touch grounding him. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean you excuse what he did. But it does mean letting go of the anger so it doesn't consume you. Lily's figured that out faster than we have. John smiled faintly, his heart swelling with pride for his daughter. She's a better person than I am. Carla squeezed his hand. She gets it from you. Meanwhile, Officer Davis continued his efforts to make amends with the community. He knew that regaining their trust would be a long, slow process, but he was committed to proving that he could change. Every day, he showed up at the community center, volunteering his time and offering to help wherever he was needed. At first, the people there were cautious around him, keeping their distance and watching him closely. But over time, as they saw his dedication, some began to soften. He was no longer the officer who had hurt Lily Parker in their eyes. She was just Alan Davis, a man trying to rebuild his life. One evening, as Davis was helping clean up after an event, a woman approached him. She had been a regular at the community center for years, always volunteering her time to help organize events and mentor local kids. Davis had noticed her before but hadn't interacted much with her. "You've been showing up a lot lately," she said, her tone neutral but not unkind. Davis looked up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Yeah, I'm trying to do what I can to make things right." The woman nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It's not easy. Is it facing the mistakes you've made?" Davis shook his head, his voice quiet. "No, it's not. But I don't have any other choice." The woman studied him for a moment, then offered a small smile. "Just keep showing up. That's all you can do." Davis nodded, grateful for her words. He knew that showing up was just the beginning, but it was a start, and for now, that was enough. The community, once so wary of Davis, began to slowly accept him again. People greeted him cautiously but kindly when he arrived at events. Children who had once avoided him started to warm up to him, asking for his help with small tasks. The healing was slow, but it was happening. One afternoon, as Davis was setting up for a food drive, he spotted John Parker across the lot, talking to some of the other volunteers. Davis' heart raced, knowing that John hadn't fully forgiven him yet. But as their eyes met across the distance, John gave Davis a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't much, but it was a sign that things were changing. Later, John approached Davis, his expression neutral but not hostile. "You've been coming here a lot." Davis nodded, his voice steady. "I have. It's the least I can do." John studied him for a moment, then spoke again. "Lily's healing. It's slow, but she's getting better." Davis' face softened. "I'm glad to hear that. She's strong." John didn't respond to that, but the tension between them seemed to ease just a little. After a long pause, John finally spoke again. "Keep doing the work, Davis. Don't stop." Davis nodded, understanding the weight of John's words. "I won't." At home, Lily continued her own healing journey. She spent more time outside, more time with her friends, and slowly began to regain her sense of normalcy. But she also carried with her the lessons she had learned through the ordeal, that the world wasn't always fair, that people could be cruel, but that forgiveness and resilience were powerful tools. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Lily sat in her room, writing in her journal. She wrote about everything that had happened, about the pain she had felt, but also about the hope she had found in the aftermath. She wasn't fully healed yet, but she was on her way. As she finished writing, she paused, thinking about Officer Davis. She didn't hate him, not anymore. She wasn't sure if she could ever fully forgive him, but she didn't need to carry that anger with her. It wasn't her burden to bear. Lily closed her journal and smiled to herself. She was ready to move forward, to leave the pain behind, and to focus on the things that made her happy. The weeks rolled into months, and with each passing day, the wounds from the incident, though not fully healed, began to fade into scars. Lily Parker had slowly returned to her usual routines, finding joy again in the small things, her friends, school, and afternoons spent at the park. But the experience had changed her in ways that were subtle, yet profound. She carried herself with a quiet strength now, her resilience shining through. John Parker noticed it too. His daughter, who had always been bright and joyful, was now wiser, more aware of the world's complexities. She wasn't just strong because she had to be, she had chosen to be. And that choice, John realized, was what set her apart from so many others. It was what made him so incredibly proud of her. A community event had been planned to bring everyone together, a celebration of the progress that had been made, and a reminder of the work still to be done. Lily had been asked to speak at the event, a request that had initially made her nervous. But after discussing it with her parents, she decided that she wanted to use her voice to share her story, not as a victim, but as a survivor. The day of the event was warm and sunny, the air filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation as people gathered in the local park. Volunteers handed out food, kids played games, and families enjoyed the sense of togetherness that had slowly returned to the community. John and Carla stood near the stage, watching as Lily prepared to speak. John's heart swelled with pride as he saw his daughter, calm and composed, standing before the crowd. She looked out at the sea of faces, her expression serious but confident. When she stepped up to the microphone, the crowd fell silent, their attention focused solely on her. Lily took a deep breath, her hands gripping the sides of the podium for support, and then she began. "Hi everyone," she said, her voice steady. "Most of you know who I am. My name is Lily Parker, and I'm here today to talk about something that happened to me, something that hurt me, and something that changed me." The crowd was quiet, hanging on her every word. A few months ago I was hurt by someone I thought I could trust. An officer, someone who was supposed to protect people, pushed me out of my wheelchair. At first I didn't understand why it happened. I didn't know what I had done wrong. But over time I realized that it wasn't about what I did. It was about what he was feeling, his anger, his frustration. He let those feelings control him. And I got hurt because of it. Lily paused, looking out at the faces in the crowd. She saw empathy, sadness, and support in their eyes. I was really angry after it happened. I felt like the world wasn't fair, like people could just hurt you, and there was nothing you could do about it. But then I realized that being angry wasn't going to help me heal. It wasn't going to make me feel better. So I made a choice. I decided that I didn't want to carry that anger with me. I decided that I wanted to forgive. There was a murmur in the crowd, soft but palpable. People were surprised by her words, such wisdom coming from someone so young. Forgiving him wasn't easy, Lily continued. And it doesn't mean that what he did was okay. But it means that I'm choosing to let go of the hate. I'm choosing to move forward with my life and focus on the things that make me happy. She looked over at her parents, who smiled proudly at her. I'm not a victim, Lily said, her voice stronger now. I'm a survivor. And I want everyone here to know that you don't have to carry the weight of someone else's actions. You can choose to let it go, and you can choose to be happy. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the park. Lily smiled, a weight lifting from her chest as she stepped back from the podium. As Lily stepped down from the stage, John met her with open arms, pulling her into a tight embrace. You were incredible, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Lily smiled up at him. Thanks, Dad. Nearby, Carla wiped tears from her eyes, beaming with pride. You're amazing, Lily. Lily shrugged, her cheeks flushing slightly. I just said what I felt. As the event continued, John noticed Officer Davis standing off to the side, watching the proceedings quietly. He hadn't expected Davis to show up, but there he was, looking small in the crowd, unsure of where he fit in. John felt a mixture of emotions, anger, pity, and something else he hadn't expected: respect. Respect for the fact that Davis had shown up, despite knowing that many in the community still harbored resentment toward him. John approached Davis, his steps measured, his face calm. When Davis saw him coming, he stiffened slightly, bracing himself for whatever might come next. You came, John said simply. Davis nodded. I did. I wanted to hear what Lily had to say. John studied him for a moment, then spoke again. She forgave you. Davis looked down at the ground, his voice quiet. I don't deserve it. John nodded, understanding the weight of those words. Maybe not, but she gave it to you anyway. Now it's up to you to live up to that. Davis swallowed hard, emotion tightening his throat. I will. I'm trying. John didn't respond immediately. He let the silence sit between them for a moment before finally speaking again. Keep trying, Davis. Don't stop. Davis met John's gaze, seeing in his eyes the resolve of a father who had fought for his daughter and was still fighting. I won't, Davis said quietly. I won't stop. The event wound down as the sun began to set, casting a warm golden light over the park. People started to pack up, the laughter and conversation slowly fading as families made their way home. Lily, still energized from her speech, stood with her parents, watching as the crowd dispersed. As they turned to leave, John glanced back one last time. He saw Davis, still lingering near the edge of the park, speaking quietly with a few members of the community. There was a long road ahead for him, John knew that. But seeing Davis there, humbly participating and showing up, gave John a small measure of hope. Lily tugged at his hand, pulling him toward the car. Come on, Dad. Let's go home. John smiled down at her, his heart full. Yeah, let's go home. As they walked back to the car, John realized something profound. The journey to healing wasn't just about finding justice or holding people accountable. It was about finding peace within yourself, about choosing to move forward instead of being weighed down by the past. And in that moment, surrounded by his family, John knew that they were all on that path together. Lily had chosen to forgive, and in doing so, she had shown everyone, her parents, her community, even Davis, that healing was possible. It wouldn't happen overnight, and it wouldn't be easy. But it was possible, and that, John thought, was enough. As the Parker family walked toward their car, the sun dipping below the horizon, John felt a renewed sense of hope. Lily had taught him that forgiveness was not a sign of weakness, but of strength. And in their journey they had discovered that true healing came from within, through resilience, love, and the courage to move forward. Before they drove away, John turned to his daughter, smiling proudly. You did something amazing today, Lily. She grinned, her eyes reflecting the last of the day's golden light. I just told my story. And in telling that story, she had inspired a community. Thank you for reading this story of resilience, forgiveness, and hope. If you found this message powerful, consider subscribing to our channel for more stories that inspire and uplift. Your support helps us continue sharing important narratives that make a difference. Don't forget to like, comment, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new story. Barrow. We don't give up that easily. For a moment, Mr. Barrow's composure slipped, a flicker of unease crossing his face. But he quickly recovered, offering Jacob a dismissive smile. I'm afraid the decision isn't up to you. If Ethan continues to be a disruptive influence, we may have to revisit his place at Emerson Prep. Jacob held the headmaster's gaze, his chest heaving with frustration, but he forced himself to take a step back. We'll see about that, he said coldly, turning on his heel and walking out of the office. As he led Ethan back to the truck, Jacob fought to keep his anger in check. He knew that Shaw and his allies were trying to break them down, to force them into a corner where they'd have no choice but to leave. But if they thought he was going to back down, they had another thing coming. Chapter 20. A Rallying Cry. 3,500 words. Ethan's suspension hit the Reed family hard, but it also sparked a new wave of support from the community. Parents who had once hesitated to speak out now rallied behind Jacob, outraged by the school's actions. They organized a protest outside the gates of Emerson Prep, holding signs that read, "Equality for all students," and "Stop the bullying." Jacob and Ethan stood at the front of the crowd, joined by Rachel, Mr. Lawson, and many of the families they had met over the past few months. Lisa Brennan covered the protest for the local news, her camera crew capturing every sign, every impassioned speech. As the crowd chanted, cars slowed down to watch, and students peered out from the windows of the school, curiosity and disbelief written on their faces. Ethan felt a surge of pride as he took in the scene. He never thought he'd see so many people standing up for him, for kids like him who just wanted a fair chance. As he looked around, he caught sight of Logan standing in one of the classroom windows, his face pale with anger. Jacob stepped up onto a makeshift platform, a bullhorn in hand. He raised it to his lips, his voice ringing out over the crowd. This school is supposed to be a place of learning, of opportunity. But instead, it's become a place where kids like my son are treated like they don't belong. We're here today to say, enough is enough. The crowd cheered, and Jacob continued, his voice growing stronger with every word. We're not here to tear down Emerson Prep. We're here to make it better, for everyone. We're here to show them that you can't buy dignity. You can't buy respect. And we're not going to be silenced anymore. The cheers grew louder, echoing off the brick walls of the school. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt a swell of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, things were starting to change. He looked at Rachel, who gave him a reassuring smile, and then at his father, who stood tall and unyielding before the crowd. But as the protest continued, a black SUV pulled up to the school gates, and Gregory Shaw stepped out, flanked by 2 security guards. He surveyed the crowd with a cold, calculating expression, then turned his gaze on Jacob. "Nice show, Reed," Shaw called out, his voice carrying over the noise. "But you're only making things worse for yourself. Walk away while you still can." Jacob stepped down from the platform, moving toward Shaw with a determined stride. "I'm not walking away, Shaw. You can threaten us all you want, but we're not going anywhere." Shaw's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing. "You're going to regret this, Reed. I promise you that." Jacob held Shaw's gaze, unflinching. "The only thing I regret is not standing up to you sooner." As Shaw turned and walked back to his SUV, Jacob felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He knew that Shaw wouldn't back down without a fight, that the road ahead would be even harder. But as he looked at the faces in the crowd, at his son standing proudly beside him, he also knew that they had something worth fighting for. And no matter what came next, they wouldn't back down. This continuation of Part 4 builds on the rising tension between Jacob, Ethan, and their opponents, showing how their fight for justice gains momentum, even as Shaw pushes back with increasing force. It deepens the emotional stakes, illustrating the strain on their family and the growing support from the community. The chapter ends on a note of determination, setting the stage for the dramatic turning point that will follow. If you'd like to continue or adjust any details, let me know. You said, continue, ChatGPT said. Certainly, here is the continuation with Part 5, bringing the story to its next dramatic turning points as tensions reach their peak. This section will build up to the major confrontation between Jacob and Shaw, while further exploring Ethan's struggle at school. The stakes will continue to rise as Jacob and Ethan's efforts put them directly in Shaw's crosshairs, leading to the kind of emotional highs and lows that set up a powerful climax. Part 5. Standing Tall. Chapters 2124, 14,000 words. Chapter 21. A Desperate Move. 3,500 words. The protest outside Emerson Prep sent ripples through the community, drawing attention from the state education board and local news stations. But the pressure on Jacob and Ethan didn't let up. Instead, Shaw doubled down on his efforts to force them out. A few days after the protest, Jacob found a letter in his mailbox, its contents stark and foreboding a formal eviction notice from the new owners of their apartment building, Shaw's lawyers. It demanded that he vacate the premises within 7 days, citing failure to comply with rental agreements and threatening legal action if he didn't comply. Jacob read the letter 3 times, his hands trembling with rage. He knew it was yet another attempt to intimidate them into silence, but that didn't make the threat any less real. Ethan came home from school that afternoon to find his father pacing the kitchen, the eviction notice crumpled in his hand. "Dad, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice wavering with uncertainty. Jacob forced a tight smile, but the tension in his jaw was impossible to hide. "It's nothing, son. Just Shaw playing more of his games." But Ethan saw the truth in his father's eyes, the exhaustion and fear that had taken root there. He reached out, gripping Jacob's arm. "We're not giving up, right? We can't let him win." Jacob looked at his son, seeing the determination in Ethan's gaze, and felt a surge of pride and anger. "No, Ethan, we're not giving up. But I think it's time we took the fight straight to Shaw." That evening, Jacob and Henry Morton met at the local diner, spreading out their legal documents on the counter between cups of coffee. Henry listened intently as Jacob explained the eviction notice, his expression growing darker with each word. "This is blatant harassment, Jacob. We need to counter this with a motion to delay the eviction, and then we go public with how they're trying to force you out." Jacob nodded, but the tension in his shoulders didn't ease. "Shaw won't stop, Henry. He's got too much to lose. We need to find something that'll put him on the defensive." Henry leaned back in his seat, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "There's always that old property contract of yours. The one Shaw tampered with. It might be time to use it." Jacob hesitated, glancing down at the worn paper that had haunted him for years. The contract had once been his father's lifeline, a symbol of the family's hopes before Shaw had twisted the law to take it all away. But now, Jacob knew that it could be their strongest weapon. "All right," Jacob said finally, his voice heavy with resolve. "Let's do it. Let's show Shaw that he can't bury the past." Chapter 22. The Power of Truth. 3,500 words. The next morning, Jacob and Henry filed the injunction to halt the eviction and presented the old property contract to the local courthouse, arguing that Shaw's acquisition of the land and his connections to Emerson Prep had been built on a foundation of deceit. They knew it would be a long shot, but Jacob felt a surge of determination as they walked out of the courthouse, clutching the documents that might just turn the tide. Meanwhile, Ethan faced a battle of his own back at Emerson Prep. The fallout from the protest had turned the school into a battleground of whispered rumors and tense stares. Some students, inspired by Ethan's courage, had begun speaking out against the administration, questioning why the school had ignored bullying for so long. But others, led by Logan and his clique, saw Ethan's actions as a betrayal. One morning, Ethan arrived at school to find his locker covered in red paint, with the words, "Traitor," scrawled across the front in bold letters. His hands shook as he stared at the mess, the humiliation burning deep in his chest. Rachel appeared beside him, her eyes flashing with anger. "We need to report this, Ethan. They can't keep getting away with this." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight. "It won't matter, Rachel. Mr. Barrow won't do anything. He'll just find a way to blame me." Rachel's expression softened, and she reached out to touch his arm. "You don't have to fight them alone. We'll make them listen. We'll make sure everyone sees the truth." Ethan looked at her, the warmth of her words seeping through the cold knot in his chest. He nodded slowly, a flicker of hope stirring in him. Maybe there was a way to make the school listen, to force them to confront what they'd ignored for so long. That afternoon, they gathered in the library with a group of students who had been inspired by the town hall meeting. They decided to write an open letter, detailing the experiences of bullying and mistreatment at Emerson Prep, and publish it in the local paper. Rachel typed furiously at her laptop, capturing their words while Ethan and the others shared their stories, each one a piece of the larger puzzle. As they worked late into the evening, the library grew quieter, the sun setting outside the windows. Ethan glanced around at the faces of his classmates' kids who had once seemed like strangers, now united by a common goal. He felt a sense of purpose swell in his chest, a conviction that they could make a difference, even if it meant going against the very institution that was supposed to protect them. When the letter was published a week later, it sent shockwaves through the community. Parents, teachers, and even alumni began to speak out, demanding accountability from Emerson Prep. Ethan's name was at the forefront of the movement, and for the first time he felt like his voice was being heard. But he also knew that their newfound momentum would come with consequences, and that Shaw wouldn't back down without a fight. Chapter 23. Shaw's Ultimatum. 3,500 words. Gregory Shaw's patience was wearing thin. He watched as the story spread through the local press, as more parents turned against Emerson Prep's leadership, and he knew that his carefully crafted image was slipping away. He summoned Laura Pierce to his downtown office, his expression grim as he poured himself a glass of scotch. "Laura, this situation is getting out of hand," Shaw growled, slamming the glass down on his desk. "That boy and his father are turning the whole town against us. We need to end this now." Laura nodded, her face tight with frustration. "What do you want me to do?" "Gregory, we've already tried everything: legal threats, pressure on the school board, even turning the community against them. But Jacob Reed won't back down." Shaw's eyes narrowed, and a dark smile curled at the corners of his lips. "Then it's time we make him an offer he can't refuse. Reach out to him, tell him that if he drops the lawsuit and moves out quietly, we'll settle his debts and let him keep his job. But if he refuses, we'll destroy whatever's left of his reputation." Laura hesitated, but she knew better than to argue with Shaw when he was in this mood. "All right, Gregory. He'll set up a meeting with Reed." That evening, Jacob received a call from Laura Pierce, asking him to meet at a local diner. He knew better than to trust her, but curiosity and a simmering anger drove him to accept. He arrived at the diner to find Laura waiting in a corner booth, her expression smug as she gestured for him to sit. "You look tired, Jacob," she said with a mock sympathy. "This fight's been hard on you, hasn't it? Hard on Ethan too. Wouldn't it be easier if you just walked away?" Jacob folded his arms, leaning back against the booth. "If you think you can buy me off, Laura, you're wasting your time." Laura's smile grew sharper. "It's not about money, Jacob. It's about making sure your son has a future. If you drop the lawsuit and agree to leave town, Gregory will settle your debts. He'll make sure Ethan can enroll in another school without any more trouble." Jacob's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his face neutral, refusing to let her see his fear. "And if I say no?" Laura's eyes glinted with malice. "Then we'll make sure everyone knows what kind of man you really are. That time you borrowed money from those shady lenders, that'll be front-page news. And Ethan, well, I'm sure the board can find a reason to expel him permanently. You wouldn't want that, would you?" Jacob felt a wave of anger rise up in his chest, hot and fierce. He leaned forward, his voice low and cold. "You think you can scare me, Laura? You think I'll just lie down and take it because you've got money and power? Well, you're wrong. My son deserves better than this, and I'm not going to stop fighting until he gets it." For a moment Laura's smile faltered and Jacob saw a flash of uncertainty in her eyes. But she quickly recovered, standing up and smoothing her expensive coat. "Suit yourself, Jacob. Just remember, you had your chance." As she walked out of the diner, Jacob clenched his fists, fighting to keep his breathing steady. He knew that refusing Laura's offer meant they would come after him harder than ever, but he also knew that he couldn't betray everything he'd fought, for everything he'd taught Ethan about standing up for what was right. Chapter 24. A Glimmer of Hope. 3,500 words. The next day, Jacob and Henry filed their evidence with the local court, challenging the eviction and revealing the details of Shaw's manipulation of the property contracts. It was a risky move, one that could backfire if Shaw's lawyers managed to discredit them. But Jacob knew they had no other choice. As they left the courthouse, Jacob's phone buzzed with a message from Lisa Brennan, the journalist who had become their ally in the fight. "We need to meet. There's something you need to see." Jacob and Ethan met Lisa at her office, a small space cluttered with stacks of newspapers and coffee cups. She led them to her desk, where her computer screen displayed a series of emails between Shaw and the school board mails that revealed Shaw's efforts to pressure the board into targeting scholarship students, including Ethan. Ethan's eyes widened as he read the messages, his hands trembling. This proves that they were going after us on purpose." Lisa nodded, her expression grim. "I got this from a source inside the board. If we make this public, it could blow the whole thing wide open." Jacob felt a surge of hope rise in his chest, tempered by the knowledge of the risks they faced. "Are you sure this will work? Lisa Shaw's not going to let this go without a fight." She met his gaze steadily. "If you're willing to stand by your story, then so am I. It's time people saw the truth about what's really going on at Emerson Prep." Jacob looked at Ethan, seeing the determination in his son's eyes, and felt a fierce pride swell within him. "All right, let's do it. Let's show them what we're made of." That night, as they sat together in their cramped apartment, Jacob and Ethan watched the news unfold on the local station, their story flashing across the screen. The emails were published, the details of Shaw's corruption laid bare for the entire town to see. Parents and teachers began to demand a full investigation, calling for the resignation of the school board members who had covered up Shaw's actions. Ethan leaned his head against Jacob's shoulder, a small, hopeful smile tugging at his lips. Do you think this means we might actually win?" Jacob wrapped an arm around his son, feeling the weight of everything they'd been through. "I don't know, kiddo. But whatever happens, we've already come further than I ever thought we could." As the screen cut to a breaking news report about the investigation into Shaw's dealings, Jacob felt a glimmer of hope take root in his chest. He knew they still had a long way to go, that Shaw wouldn't back down easily. But for the first time in a long time, he believed that they might just have a chance. This continuation of Part 5 builds the tension to a new peak, exploring the fallout from Jacob's decision to stand firm and the risks they face as they challenge Shaw's power. It deepens the emotional stakes between Jacob and Ethan, while also setting the stage for the next dramatic turn in their battle against the school's corruption. If you'd like to proceed with more chapters or focus on any specific part of the story, let me know. "You said, continue," ChatGPT said. "Absolutely, let's dive into the continuation with Part 6, where the story reaches its peak. This part will focus on the consequences of exposing Shaw's corruption, the intensifying pressure on Jacob and Ethan, and the critical moments that push them toward a major showdown. This section will drive the narrative toward its climactic resolution, highlighting both the emotional strain and the courage required to face such overwhelming odds." Part 6. The Battle for Justice. Chapters 25-28, 14,000 words. Chapter 25. The Calm Before the Storm. 3,500 words. The release of the emails between Shaw and the Emerson Prep Board sent shockwaves through the town. The scandal dominated the local news, with headlines like "Corruption at Emerson Prep, Allegations of Targeting Scholarship Students Emerge." Reporters camped outside the school's gates, hoping for a statement from Mr. Barrow or any member of the school board. Parents gathered in small groups, buzzing with rumors, and the tension in the air felt like a live wire. For a brief moment, Jacob allowed himself to hope that their fight might finally be nearing its end. He watched the news reports with a sense of vindication, knowing that Shaw's power was starting to crack. But as the days went by, he also noticed the shadows under Henry Morton's eyes growing darker, the way his phone buzzed constantly with new updates from the courthouse. One evening, as Jacob and Ethan sat at their kitchen table going over a new round of legal documents, Henry called with a grim note in his voice. "Jacob, we need to talk. Shaw's lawyers filed a countersuit this afternoon, claiming defamation and loss of business revenue. They're going after you personally. And it's not just about the eviction anymore, they want damages." Jacob felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "How much are they asking for?" Henry hesitated before answering. $200,000. "Enough to bankrupt you, even if you manage to win the original suit." For a moment Jacob couldn't speak, the sheer scope of the threat freezing him in place. He glanced across the table at Ethan, who was watching him with wide, fearful eyes. Jacob forced himself to keep his voice steady. "What do we do, Henry?" Henry's sigh crackled through the phone, heavy with exhaustion. "We keep fighting, Jacob. But it's going to be a long road, and I can't promise it'll end well. Shaw's throwing everything he has at you because he knows he's cornered. If you're not ready for that, you need to tell me now." Jacob closed his eyes, letting the words sink in. He thought about the months of struggle, the sacrifices they'd made, and the countless nights when he'd seen the light go out in Ethan's eyes. He thought about everything they had lost, and everything they still had left to fight for. "I'm ready, Henry," he said quietly. "We're all in. Whatever it takes." After he hung up, Jacob turned to Ethan, seeing the uncertainty in his son's gaze. He reached across the table, gripping Ethan's hand tightly. "We're not going to let them scare us, Ethan. We've come this far, and we're not turning back now." Ethan nodded, though his voice trembled. "I believe you, Dad. I hope it's enough." Chapter 26. The Courtroom Showdown. 3,500 words. The courtroom battle began in earnest the following week. Shaw's legal team arrived with stacks of paperwork, their arguments polished and ruthless, but Henry Morton was ready. He stood by Jacob's side in the packed courtroom, presenting their evidence with a calm, measured determination that countered Shaw's bluster. The proceedings dragged on for days, stretching into weeks, with witnesses called and cross-examinations turning the small courtroom into a battleground. The tension was palpable, a constant hum in the air that weighed on everyone present. Reporters filled the benches at the back, their pens scratching across notepads as they recorded every twist and turn. Ethan sat beside his father, listening to the legal jargon with a clenched jaw, trying to make sense of the shifting tides of hope and fear. Sometimes, it seemed like they were winning, like Henry's arguments were cutting through Shaw's lies and turning the tide in their favor. But then, Shaw's lawyers would twist the narrative back around, painting Jacob as a disgruntled troublemaker who had sought out the fight for personal gain. One particularly grueling afternoon, Laura Pierce took the stand, her voice smooth and confident as she described Jacob as a disruptive influence who had stirred up trouble for the school since the day he arrived. "It's clear that Mr. Reed's only goal has been to tarnish the reputation of Emerson Prep and to undermine the values of our institution," she declared, shooting a pointed glance at Jacob. Henry's rebuttal was sharp, but the damage had been done. The murmurs that rippled through the courtroom made Jacob's stomach turn with anxiety. He looked over at Ethan, who was staring down at his hands, his face pale. When the session ended, Jacob tried to offer his son a reassuring smile. "We're doing all right, Ethan. Henry's got a plan. He's going to call Mr. Lawson as a witness next. That should help." But Ethan shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. "They're making us sound like we're the bad guys, Dad. What if no one believes us?" Jacob knelt beside Ethan's chair, gripping his shoulders tightly. "I know it's hard, but we can't give up now. We've got the truth on our side, Ethan. We just have to make them see it." Ethan swallowed hard, trying to find strength in his father's words. He nodded, but Jacob could see the doubt lingering in his eyes, and he knew that the fight was taking its toll on both of them. Chapter 27. A shocking turn. 3,500 words. As the trial dragged into its final week, tensions reached a fever pitch. Henry Morton put Mr. Lawson on the stand, and his testimony shed new light on the toxic culture at Emerson Prep. He described how he had witnessed Shaw and Mr. Barrow working together to push out scholarship students who didn't fit the image the school wanted to maintain. His words caused a stir in the courtroom, and for a moment it seemed like the tide might finally be turning in their favor. But just as hope began to flicker, Shaw made a move that stunned everyone in the courtroom. He took the stand himself, turning on the charm with a smooth smile that belied the venom in his words. "I admit that we may have made mistakes in the past," Shaw said, casting a contrite look toward the jury. "But I have always acted in the best interests of Emerson Prep." Jacob Reed, on the other hand, has shown a consistent pattern of aggression and dishonesty. He has attempted to manipulate public opinion against our school, even going so far as to stage protests and spread false accusations. Shaw's words dripped with calculated malice, and the jury watched him with a mixture of skepticism and interest. Henry tried to counter his claims, but Shaw's polished delivery had left an impression. After the session, Henry caught up with Jacob and Ethan outside the courthouse, his expression grim. "We've still got a chance, but it's going to come down to the closing arguments. We need to remind the jury why we're fighting this battle." Jacob nodded, but his hands shook as he placed them on Ethan's shoulders. "Are you okay, Ethan? I know this has been hard." Ethan forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm fine, Dad. Just tired, I guess." Jacob felt a pang of guilt. He knew how much his son had sacrificed to be here, how many sleepless nights and painful days had brought them to this point. And he knew that whatever happened in the courtroom, they would never be able to get those moments back. That night, as they sat together in their small apartment, Jacob pulled out the old family photo album that had been buried in the back of his closet. He flipped through the pages, showing Ethan pictures of his grandparents, of the house they'd lost, of the life that had once seemed so certain. "This is where we came from, Ethan," Jacob said quietly, tracing a finger over a faded photograph of his father standing in front of the old family home. "But where we're going, that's up to us. And no matter what happens, I'm proud of you for standing with me." Ethan leaned against his father, letting the warmth of the moment sink into his bones. For the first time in weeks, he felt a small sense of peace, knowing that no matter what the future held, they had faced this fight together. Chapter 28. The final day. 3,500 words. The final day of the trial dawned with a gray, overcast sky, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Jacob and Ethan arrived at the courthouse early, joined by Rachel, Mr. E. Lawson, and a handful of parents who had supported them throughout their fight. The air was thick with tension as they filed into the courtroom, taking their seats and waiting for the proceedings to begin. Henry delivered a closing argument that was as impassioned as it was eloquent, reminding the jury of the evidence they had presented. The emails, the testimony, the pattern of discrimination that had gone unchallenged for years. "This case isn't just about Jacob Reed and his son Ethan," Henry declared, his voice ringing out through the courtroom. "It's about standing up against those who think they can use their power to trample on the rights of others. It's about holding those in power accountable for the harm they've caused." He turned to Jacob, then to Ethan, who watched with wide, hopeful eyes. "It's about the courage of one father who refused to give up on his son, and a young man who dared to speak the truth even when the world was against him." As Henry stepped down, Shaw's lead attorney took the floor, delivering a polished, methodical rebuttal that painted Jacob as reckless and impulsive, willing to drag the town through the mud to settle a personal vendetta. His arguments were calm, measured, and designed to play on the doubts that still lingered in the jury's minds. When the jury finally retired to deliberate, the silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Jacob sat beside Ethan, gripping his son's hand tightly, feeling every second stretch into eternity. He glanced over at Shaw, who sat across the aisle with a cold, satisfied smile, and felt a chill run down his spine. He knew that the outcome of this trial would change their lives forever. After hours that felt like days, the jury returned, their faces unreadable as they took their seats. The foreman stood, clearing his throat before reading the verdict. "In the matter of Reed versus Shaw, we find in favor of the plaintiff, Jacob Reed, on the grounds of wrongful eviction and harassment. However, on the countersuit of defamation and damages, we find in favor of the defendant." Jacob felt the breath rush out of his lungs, the mixed verdict hitting him like a wave. He had won a crucial battle, but Shaw had managed to protect himself from full accountability. It wasn't the resounding victory he'd hoped for, but it was a victory nonetheless. Ethan's face lit up with a cautious smile, and he hugged his father tightly. "We did it, Dad. We made them see the truth." Jacob wrapped his arms around his son, holding him close as relief flooded through him. He knew that their fight wasn't truly over, that the road ahead would still be difficult. But as he looked around the courtroom, at the faces of those who had stood by them, he realized that they had already achieved something he hadn't dared to hope for. They had shown the town that the truth mattered. They had shown that even the most powerful could be challenged. And for the first time in a long time, Jacob allowed himself to believe that the future might hold something better. This continuation brings Part 6 to a climax, delivering a mixed but meaningful outcome to Jacob and Ethan's struggle, while keeping the door open for further resolution and growth. The courtroom scenes intensify the stakes and deepen the emotional journey, leading to a turning point where both characters must reckon with what they've gained and lost in their fight. If you'd like to continue with more of the story, or have specific elements you'd like to explore, let me know. You said, continue? ChatGPT said, sure, let's continue with Part 7, where the fallout from the mixed verdict reshapes the battle lines. With the trial over, Jacob and Ethan face new challenges and uncertainties, even as the community's support begins to change the landscape at Emerson Prep. This part will focus on the aftermath of the trial, the tensions between Jacob, Ethan, and their opponents, and the slow process of building a better future. It will also introduce new complications that push the story toward its ultimate resolution. Part 7, Rebuilding and Resilience. Chapters 29-32, 13,000 words. Chapter 29. After the verdict. 3,000 words. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and curious onlookers as Jacob and Ethan emerged into the cold afternoon air. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust toward them, and voices clamored for a statement. Jacob raised a hand, his voice steady despite the exhaustion etched on his face. "I'm grateful that the jury saw the truth in part of our case. But this isn't the end of our fight. We'll keep working to make sure that Emerson Prep becomes a place where every student, regardless of background, can learn without fear." The reporters pressed for more questions about Shaw, about the countersuit decision, about what would come next. But Jacob gently guided Ethan through the crowd, heading for the parking lot where Henry waited with a tired but satisfied smile. "Good job in there, Jacob," Henry said, clapping him on the back. "You've made a real difference, don't forget that. But you should know that Shaw's lawyers are already working to appeal the ruling. He's not going to let this go quietly." Jacob nodded, his expression grim. "I figured as much. But we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Right now, I just want to make sure Ethan's okay." As they drove home, Ethan stared out the window, watching the town pass by in a blur of gray and brown. The sense of relief from the courtroom had already begun to fade, replaced by the uncertainty of what the future would hold. "Dad, do you think things will actually change at school now?" Ethan asked, breaking the silence. "Or will it just go back to the way it was?" Jacob glanced at his son, seeing the worry in his eyes, and felt a familiar pang of frustration. He wished he could give Ethan the certainty he craved, but the truth was that the future still felt as precarious as ever. "I don't know, Ethan," he admitted quietly, "but I do know that we've come too far to give up now. We've shown people what's really going on. That has to mean something." Ethan nodded slowly, though doubt still lingered in his expression. As they pulled into the parking lot of their apartment building, Jacob spotted a small gathering of neighbors waiting for them. A few of them clapped as they stepped out of the truck, offering words of encouragement. "You did good, Jacob," called out Mrs. Turner, the elderly woman who lived on the floor below. "You gave that school a wake-up call, and a lot of us are proud of you." Jacob managed a small smile, thanking them for their support. He knew that their victory in court wouldn't magically solve everything, that they still had to fight Shaw's appeal, that they still faced an uphill battle to keep their home. But for the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward. Chapter 30. Back to school, 3,000 words. Ethan returned to Emerson Prep a week after the verdict, his heart heavy with uncertainty. The whispers started the moment he walked through the front doors, the eyes of students and teachers tracking his every move. He knew that, in some people's eyes, he would always be the troublemaker, the kid who had challenged the status quo and brought scandal to their pristine halls. But there were other reactions. 2 new glances of respect from a few students who had never spoken to him before. A sophomore from his history class approached him in the hallway, offering a hesitant smile. "Hey Ethan, I read about what you did in the paper. It's pretty cool standing up like that." Ethan managed a small smile, nodding awkwardly. "Thanks." Rachel found him by his locker later that morning, her face lit up with relief. "It's good to have you back, Ethan. I know things are still a mess, but it feels like maybe we've started to make a difference." Ethan leaned against his locker, his shoulders slumping with the weight of everything he'd been carrying. "I don't know, Rachel. Shaw's not out yet, and Logan's still running the show with his friends. It's like, every time I think we're making progress, there's another wall in the way." Rachel touched his arm gently, her eyes serious. "You've done more than you think, Ethan, and you're not alone anymore. We've got people on our side now. If Shaw's lawyers want to drag this out, then we'll be ready for them." Ethan met her gaze, feeling a flicker of hope break through the exhaustion that had settled in his bones. He knew that there was still a long road ahead, that the appeal process could stretch on for months, that the school's culture wouldn't change overnight. But Rachel's words reminded him that he wasn't fighting this battle alone, and that small victories still mattered. That afternoon, Ethan and Rachel walked together to their next class, passing by Logan in the hallway. He shot them a sneer, but Ethan held his head high, refusing to let Logan's disdain drag him down. He had faced far worse than Logan Pierce's insults, and he wasn't about to let them define him. Chapter 31. Shaw's Last Stand. 3,500 words. As Shaw's lawyers pushed forward with the appeal, the school board faced increasing pressure from the community to address the revelations that had come to light during the trial. Parents held meetings in church basements and community centers, demanding more accountability from the board, and local news stations ran stories about the calls for change at Emerson Prep. One rainy afternoon, Jacob and Henry met with a new group of parents who had come forward, sharing stories of how their children had been overlooked and dismissed by the administration. They gathered in a small office space donated by a local charity, surrounded by stacks of petitions and copies of the emails that had sparked the investigation. A woman named Linda Martinez, whose daughter had struggled to keep up in her classes due to undiagnosed dyslexia, stood up and spoke with a quaver in her voice. "We never thought anyone would listen to us, but seeing you and Ethan stand up against Shawit gave us hope. I just want my daughter to have a fair shot." Jacob listened to her words, feeling the weight of their stories settle in his chest. He knew that they had become more than just a family fighting for themselves. They had become a symbol of resistance against a system that had failed too many kids. It was a burden, but it was also a source of strength. As the meeting wrapped up, Henry pulled Jacob aside, lowering his voice. "We're making progress, but Shaw's still got influence on the board. He's using every trick he knows to keep them from acting. If we're going to force real change, we need to show the town that the fight isn't over." Jacob nodded, Thinking back to the town hall meeting that had helped shift public opinion months ago, he knew that they needed to keep the pressure on, to remind everyone what was at stake. Let's organize another rally, something big enough that Shaw can't ignore it. The rally was scheduled for the following week, with dozens of families pledging to attend. Ethan, Rachel, and their friends helped spread the word, handing out flyers and posting on social media. By the time the day arrived, the area outside Emerson Prep's gates was packed with parents, students, and community members, holding signs that read, "Justice for all students and no more secrets." As the rain poured down, soaking through their coats, Jacob stepped up onto a makeshift stage, clutching a bullhorn. He raised it to his lips, speaking over the roar of the rain. "We're here today because we believe in a school that respects every student, not just those who fit into a narrow mold. We're here because Emerson Prep has a responsibility to do better, and we're not leaving until they hear us." The crowd cheered, and Jacob felt a swell of determination surge through him. He knew that Shaw was watching from the shadows, that he still had allies on the board who could try to stonewall their efforts. But as he looked out over the faces in the crowd, he also knew that they had built something powerful, a movement that couldn't be silenced. Chapter 32. An Unexpected Ally, 3,000 Words. As the rally wound down, with chants of equality now still echoing in the air, Jacob felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Mr. Barrow standing behind him, his face pale and drawn, but with a strange resolve in his eyes. "Mr. Reed, can we talk?" Barrow asked, his voice barely audible over the din. "I think it's time we had a real conversation away from Shaw's influence." Jacob raised an eyebrow, surprised by the sudden shift in the headmaster's demeanor. He nodded, following Barrow into a small side alley, where the noise of the crowd faded into the background. Ethan and Henry stayed nearby, keeping a wary eye on the exchange. "I'm not here to apologize," Barrow said, his expression tight with discomfort. "But I've seen what Shaw's capable of, and I know that if he stays in control, this school's reputation is going to be damaged beyond repair. I don't want to see that happen." Jacob crossed his arms, studying the man in front of him. "Why are you telling me this now? Barrow, you've spent months defending him." Barrow looked away, a shadow passing over his face. "Because I was scared. Shaw has connections, and he knows how to ruin people's lives. But I can't ignore what's happening anymore. I know you don't trust me, but I want to help make things right." Jacob felt a flash of anger, thinking of all the times Barrow had turned a blind eye to Ethan's suffering, to the mistreatment of the scholarship students. But beneath that anger, he saw something else, a glimmer of sincerity. A man trying to make amends, even if it was too late for redemption. "What do you have in mind?" Jacob asked, his voice rough. Barrow hesitated, then leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "There are documents, old contracts, meeting minutes, things that Shaw didn't want anyone to see. I can help you get them, but you'll have to be careful. If he finds out what I'm doing, he'll destroy me." Jacob felt a surge of hope, mingled with wariness. It could be a trap, another ploy to undermine their efforts. But it could also be the break they needed, the proof that would finally force Shaw out for good. He glanced back at Ethan, who watched them with a furrowed brow, and then nodded. "All right, Barrow," Jacob said. "If you're serious about this, then let's do it. But if you double-cross us, I'll make sure the whole town knows what you're really about." Barrow swallowed, then nodded stiffly. "I understand. Meet me at the school on Monday night, after hours. I'll have the files ready." As Barrow slipped back into the shadows, Jacob turned to Ethan, his mind racing with the possibilities. He knew they were stepping into dangerous territory, that Shaw would come down on them with everything he had if he discovered their plan. But he also knew that for the first time, they might have the upper hand. And as the rain continued to fall, washing away the traces of the rally, Jacob and Ethan shared a determined look, ready to face whatever came next. This continuation in Part 7 builds on the aftermath of the courtroom battle, exploring the shifting alliances and deepening resolve of Jacob, Ethan, and their community. It introduces a new twist with Mr. Barrow's decision to turn against Shaw, setting up the final confrontation that will determine the future of Emerson Prep. This section focuses on the emotional weight of the struggle, the fragile hope of change, and the risks they take as they move toward the ultimate showdown. If you'd like to proceed with the next part, or adjust any elements, let me know. "You said, continue," ChatGPT said. "Certainly, let's continue with Part 8, which will focus on the final escalation and the build-up to a decisive confrontation. With Mr. Barrow's unexpected help, Jacob, Ethan, and their allies are poised to make their most daring move yet, while Shaw, sensing his control slipping, prepares a final, desperate counterattack. This part will increase the tension to its highest point, pushing the characters to the edge as they confront the truth about what's at stake. Part 8. The Final Showdown Chapters. 3336, 14,000 words. Chapter 33. Secrets Uncovered. 3,500 words. Monday night came with a heavy fog rolling in, shrouding the grounds of Emerson Prep in a thick blanket of mist. The school's grand facade loomed above the empty parking lot, its windows dark and lifeless. Jacob and Ethan pulled up in their old truck, parking behind the maintenance shed to avoid being seen from the road. Ethan's heart raced as he glanced nervously toward the school's entrance. "Are you sure about this?" Dad Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jacob gave a tight nod, adjusting the collar of his jacket against the chill. "We don't have a choice, Ethan. If Barrow really has the documents he promised, this could be the proof we need to end Shaw's influence for good." They walked quietly toward the side entrance where Mr. Barrow had told them to meet him. As they approached, the door creaked open, revealing Barrow's tense face. He gestured for them to hurry inside, glancing around nervously. "Did anyone see you?" Barrow asked, his voice low and urgent. Jacob shook his head, stepping inside with Ethan at his heels. "No, but we need to move fast. What have you got for us?" Barrow led them through the darkened hallways, past rows of trophy cases that glinted dimly in the faint light. They arrived at his office, where stacks of file boxes waited on the desk, each one labeled with dates that stretched back years. Barrow locked the door behind them and began rifling through the boxes, pulling out folders thick with papers. "These are the original meeting minutes from the school board before Shaw consolidated his control," Barrow explained, his hands trembling slightly as he spread the documents across the desk. "They show how he manipulated the board to push out scholarship programs, how he used his influence to secure contracts that benefited his own businesses. And here," he handed a thick file to Jacob, the cover marked with a red stamp that read, "Confidential." "These are the property agreements. The ones he never wanted anyone to see." Jacob flipped open the file, his eyes scanning the dense legal language. He found a clause buried deep within the document, one that directly contradicted Shaw's public claims about owning the property outright. It revealed that the land Emerson Prep sat on had been part of a trust established by Shaw's grandfather, meant to serve as a community education center, not a for-profit institution. Over the years, Shaw had quietly twisted the terms of the trust, funneling its assets into his own accounts. Ethan leaned over Jacob's shoulder, reading the words with wide eyes. "Dad, this proves that Shaw's been lying the whole time. He doesn't have the right to run the school like this." Jacob's hands tightened around the edges of the file, a fierce determination burning in his chest. "This is it, Ethan. This is what we've been waiting for. If we can get this in front of the state education board, they'll have no choice but to intervene." Barrow swallowed hard, his face drawn with anxiety. "You need to move quickly. If Shaw finds out what you've got, he'll come after you with everything he has. And if he realizes I helped you..." Jacob met Barrow's gaze, seeing the fear behind his eyes. "You're doing the right thing, Barrow. But you'd better be careful too. If Shaw's as desperate as we think he is, he won't hesitate to throw you under the bus." Barrow nodded, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "I know. I've already made arrangements to be out of town for a while just in case. Now go take the files and get out of here." Jacob and Ethan gathered up the papers, stuffing them into a duffel bag, and slipped back out into the misty night. As they hurried back to the truck, Ethan cast a last glance back at the dark silhouette of the school, feeling a mixture of fear and anticipation. He knew that they had just crossed a line, that there was no turning back from the fight that lay ahead. Chapter 34. Shaw Strikes Back. 3,500 words. The next morning, Jacob and Ethan delivered the files to Henry Morton's office, where they spread out the documents across the conference table. Henry's face lit up as he examined the property agreements, a triumphant gleam in his eyes. "This is exactly what we needed, Jacob. We'll file for an injunction with the state board first thing tomorrow. If they see this, they'll have grounds to freeze Shaw's control over the school's assets, and we'll push for a full audit of his finances." But even as they celebrated their discovery, the reality of Shaw's reach became painfully clear. By noon, word of their investigation had leaked to the press, and Shaw's lawyers retaliated with a public statement, accusing Jacob and Henry of engaging in a smear campaign to destabilize a respected educational institution. Shaw himself appeared on the local news, flanked by Laura Pierce, delivering a carefully crafted message to the camera. "This is a desperate attempt by a disgruntled individual to drag our school's name through the mud. Shaw declared, his expression somber but composed. "I have always acted in the best interests of our students, and I will not allow baseless accusations to undermine the integrity of Emerson Prep." As the broadcast played on the small TV in Henry's office, Jacob's fists clenched in anger. "He's twisting everything, making us out to be the villains." Henry frowned, turning off the TV. "He's trying to control the narrative, but he doesn't know that we've got the evidence to back up our claims. The important thing now is to get these documents in front of the board and let the facts speak for themselves." But even as they planned their next steps, a new threat emerged. That evening, Jacob's phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He answered, and a deep, unfamiliar voice spoke on the other end. "Mr. Reed, you've made a lot of enemies with your little crusade. You do well to back off before things get difficult for you and your son." Jacob's blood ran cold, but he kept his voice steady. "Is that a threat?" "Take it however you want," the voice replied. "But if you know what's good for you, you'll drop this case and keep your mouth shut. Otherwise, you'll be sorry." Jacob hung up, his hands shaking with a mixture of fear and fury. He knew that Shaw was behind the call, that he was trying to rattle them into submission. But instead of backing down, it only hardened Jacob's resolve. He turned to Ethan, who had overheard the call and was watching with wide eyes. "We're not going to let them scare us, Ethan. We've got the truth on our side, and we're going to see this through to the end." Ethan nodded, but Jacob could see the worry etched in his son's face. He placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, trying to offer what comfort he could. "We'll get through this, son. Together." Chapter 35. A Last Stand. 3,500 words. The next day, Jacob, Ethan, and Henry made their way to the State Board's office, carrying the crucial files in a locked briefcase. They arrived early, passing through the metal detectors and making their way to the hearing room, where a panel of officials waited behind a long, polished table. Shaw's legal team was already there, their expressions smug and confident. But as Jacob laid out the evidence, presenting the hidden clauses in the property trust and the records of financial mismanagement, he watched their expressions shift from arrogance to something darker: fear. Ethan watched from the gallery, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't understand most of the legal jargon, but he could see the shift in the room's atmosphere as the board members leaned forward, scrutinizing the documents that Henry presented. For the first time, it felt like they were being taken seriously, like the weight of the evidence was too much to ignore. When the board called a recess to review the materials, Jacob and Henry stepped outside to the hallway, where reporters waited with cameras and microphones. Shaw's legal team, meanwhile, huddled together in the corner, speaking in hushed tones. Shaw himself approached Jacob, his expression livid. "You think you've won, Reed? You think a few pieces of paper are going to bring me down?" Jacob squared his shoulders, meeting Shaw's glare head-on. "It's over, Shaw. You can't keep hiding behind your money and your lies. The truth is out, and people are finally starting to see who you really are." Shaw's lips twisted into a sneer. "You're a fool, Reed. You have no idea how far I'm willing to go to protect what's mine. If you keep pushing, you'll lose everything." Jacob's jaw clenched, but before he could respond, the doors to the hearing room swung open, and a board official gestured for them to return. "The board has reached a preliminary decision." Ethan gripped the edge of his seat as they filed back into the room, barely daring to breathe. He could see the tension in his father's face, the determination in Henry's stride, and he knew that everything they had fought for hinged on what would come next. Chapter 36. The Decision. 3,500 words. The board chair, a gray-haired woman with a sharp gaze, cleared her throat as she addressed the room. "After reviewing the evidence presented, we have determined that there is sufficient cause to conduct a full investigation into Mr. Shaw's handling of the Emerson Prep Trust and his financial activities. Effective immediately, Mr. Shaw is suspended from all decision-making authority related to the school until the investigation is complete." A wave of murmurs swept through the room, and Ethan felt a surge of relief wash over him. He glanced at his father, who allowed himself a small, victorious smile. Henry clapped Jacob on the back, his expression jubilant. But Shaw's face was a mask of barely contained rage. He shot a venomous look at Jacob, his voice barely a whisper as he leaned closer. "You haven't won anything yet, Reed. He'll find a way to turn this around." Jacob met Shaw's glare with steady eyes. "Good luck with that, Shaw. The truth has a way of catching up with people like you." As Shaw stormed out of the room, flanked by his lawyers, Jacob turned to Ethan, his heart swelling with pride as he pulled his son into a tight hug. "We did it, Ethan. We finally did it." Ethan clung to his father, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the nightmare was finally coming to an end. The reporters swarmed them as they left the hearing room, asking questions about their next steps, about how it felt to see Shaw finally held accountable. Jacob answered as best he could, but in his mind, he was already thinking ahead to the changes they could make at Emerson Prep, to the possibility of building something better. As they stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air, the sun breaking through the clouds, Jacob and Ethan exchanged a look of shared determination. They knew that the fight wasn't over, that there were still battles to be fought, still changes to be made. But for the first time in a long time, they felt like they had a chance to shape the future instead of just surviving it. And as they walked away from the courthouse side by side, they knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. This continuation in Part 8 brings the story to a high point of tension, as the struggle between Jacob, Ethan, and Shaw reaches its most intense and dramatic moments. The scenes explore the risks of uncovering the truth, the pressure of facing off against a powerful adversary, and the emotional release of seeing justice finally begin to take shape. It sets the stage for a final resolution in the next chapters, where the consequences of the battle and the future of Emerson Prep will be decided. If you'd like to proceed with the concluding part, or have any adjustments in mind, let me know. You said, continue, ChatGPT said. Certainly, let's move forward with Part 9, focusing on the resolution and aftermath of Jacob and Ethan's struggle. This part will bring closure to the long-standing conflicts, explore the lasting impact of their fight on the community and Emerson Prep, and showcase how Jacob and Ethan move forward after their victory. The story will conclude with a mix of personal and community triumphs, while acknowledging that change is an ongoing journey. Part 9. A New Beginning. Chapters 3740. 13,000 words. Chapter 37. The Winds of Change. 3,500 words. The news of Shaw's suspension spread quickly, sending ripples through the town and through Emerson Prep's corridors. Parents who had previously been hesitant to speak out began voicing their concerns more openly. Former students and teachers came forward with stories of Shaw's manipulations and unethical behavior, and local news stations followed every development, turning the spotlight on Emerson Prep's internal struggles. For Jacob and Ethan, the days following the board's decision were filled with a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. They knew that the investigation would take time, that Shaw's influence might still linger in the shadows, but they also felt the weight of the fight beginning to lift. One morning, as they sat together over breakfast in their small kitchen, Ethan glanced at his father with a cautious smile. "Do you think this means we might finally get a break, Dad?" Jacob stirred his coffee, his expression thoughtful. "I think it means we've earned a little breathing room, Ethan. But there's still a lot we need to do if we want things to really change at the school. Shaw's going to fight back any way he can, and we have to be ready for that." Ethan nodded, but the hope in his eyes remained. He had grown so much over the course of their struggles, stronger, more determined, more willing to speak out for what he believed in. He thought back to the days when he used to hide in the library, hoping to go unnoticed, and realized how far he had come. That afternoon, they met with Henry Morton and several of the parents who had become their allies. They gathered in a local community center, where they discussed plans to create a new advisory council for the school loan that would include both scholarship families and the children of wealthy donors. They wanted to ensure that the changes they'd fought for would last beyond the current crisis. "We need to make sure that what happened to Ethan never happens to another kid at this school," Jacob said, his voice firm as he addressed the group. "This advisory council will give parents and students a real voice. And with Shaw out of the picture, we can work with the new administration to make this place fair for everyone." Linda Martinez, the mother whose daughter had struggled with dyslexia, nodded in agreement. "It's about time someone listened to us. And with people like you leading the way, Jacob, I think we've got a real chance to make a difference." Jacob offered her a grateful smile, but inside, he knew that the road ahead would still be bumpy. There were still those who clung to the old ways, who believed that Emerson Prep's exclusivity was its greatest strength. But as he looked around the room at the faces of the parents who had joined their fight, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Chapter 38. Facing Old Fears. 3,000 words. Back at Emerson Prep, the atmosphere was tense but charged with a sense of possibility. Mr. Barrow, now temporarily acting as head of the school in Shaw's absence, made a surprising announcement, an open forum where students, teachers, and parents could voice their concerns and suggest changes to the school's policies. The forum was held in the school's large auditorium, the same space where Ethan had once faced the taunts and mockery of his peers. As he and Jacob walked through the double doors, they saw that the room was packed with students and families, some hopeful, some skeptical, but all watching with interest as the speakers took the stage. Ethan felt his palms grow sweaty as he looked out over the crowd. It was a far cry from the small town hall meetings they had started with, and he knew that this was their chance to make a lasting impact. He glanced at Rachel, who gave him an encouraging nod from her seat near the front row. Mr. Barrow stepped up to the microphone, his face pale but determined. "This school is going through a period of change," he began, his voice echoing through the auditorium. "And we owe it to our students, especially those we have failed in the past, to listen to their voices. Today, we are here to start a new conversation about what Emerson Prep can become." Jacob took a deep breath as he walked to the podium, with Ethan following close behind. As he spoke, he talked about the importance of fairness, of giving every student the chance to thrive, regardless of their background. He shared the story of their fight, of the challenges they had faced, and the community that had rallied around them. "We can't erase the mistakes of the past," Jacob said, his voice steady and clear. "But we can build something better if we're willing to do the hard work. It's not about tearing down what makes Emerson Prep special, it's about making sure that every student feels like they belong here." Ethan stepped forward to speak next, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted the microphone. He looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, some unfriendly, but he found his courage in the memory of everything they had endured. "I used to be afraid of this place," Ethan said quietly, his voice carrying through the auditorium. "I thought that because I came from a different background, I didn't belong. But I've learned that belonging isn't about what you wear or how much money your family has. It's about being treated with respect. And it's about standing up for yourself when people try to make you feel small." As Ethan's words filled the room, he saw Logan sitting near the back, his expression conflicted. For a moment their eyes met, and Ethan thought he saw a flicker of something like regret cross Logan's face. It wasn't an apology, but it was a start. After the forum ended, Rachel caught up with Ethan in the hallway, her eyes bright with pride. "You were amazing up there, Ethan. You really made them listen." Ethan shrugged, trying to hide his embarrassment, but he couldn't keep the smile off his face. "Thanks, Rachel. I hope it's enough to make a difference." Rachel squeezed his hand, her voice gentle. "It already is, Ethan. And no matter what happens next, I'm proud of you." Chapter 39. A Final Confrontation. 3,500 words. The fallout from the open forum rippled through the school. While many students and parents embraced the idea of a more inclusive Emerson Prep, others resisted the changes, clinging to the old ways that Shaw had represented. Tensions simmered, with whispers about who might replace Shaw permanently as head of the school. It was during this uncertain period that Shaw made his move. One rainy afternoon, as Jacob and Ethan were packing up to leave school, Shaw appeared in the parking lot, flanked by two of his remaining loyalists. His face was a mask of cold fury, and he stepped in front of their truck, blocking their path. "Reed," Shaw said, his voice low and dangerous, "you think you've won? You think a few signatures on a piece of paper are going to take away everything I've built? You're deluding yourself." Jacob climbed out of the truck, keeping himself between Shaw and Ethan. He met Shaw's glare without flinching. "It's over, Shaw. The board's going to see through your lies, and you're going to have to answer for everything you've done." Shaw's lips curled into a sneer. "You think you're some kind of hero, but all you've done is tear apart a school that's been a pillar of this town for generations. You and your son, you don't belong here, and you never will." Ethan stepped out from behind his father, his voice shaking but defiant. "That's where you're wrong, Shaw. We do belong here. And no matter what you try to do to us, we're not going anywhere." For a moment, Shaw's expression faltered, revealing the bitterness beneath his carefully crafted exterior. He took a step forward, his voice dropping to a venomous hiss. "You'll regret this, Reed. I'll make sure of it." Before Jacob could respond, Mr. Barrow appeared at the edge of the parking lot, flanked by a security officer. "That's enough, Shaw. You're not welcome here anymore. If you don't leave right now, I'll have you escorted off the property." Shaw's face turned an ugly shade of red, but he finally backed down, turning to leave with a final glare over his shoulder. As he disappeared into the rain, Jacob felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he also knew that the real victory was still ahead. Chapter 40. A New Beginning. 3,000 words. In the weeks that followed, the investigation into Shaw's financial dealings continued, leading to his permanent removal from the school's board. Mr. Barrow, with the help of Jacob, Henry, and the newly formed advisory council, began the slow process of rebuilding Emerson Prep's reputation. Parents who had once been skeptical of the changes began to see the benefits of a more inclusive community. Scholarships were expanded, new mentorship programs were established, and students from all backgrounds were encouraged to participate in leadership roles. Ethan found himself in the middle of these changes, helping to mentor younger students who struggled to find their place in the school. He spent afternoons in the library with kids who reminded him of himself, kids who just needed someone to listen, to remind them that they mattered. One sunny afternoon, as Ethan walked across the newly renovated school courtyard, he spotted Logan sitting alone on one of the benches, staring at the ground. For a moment Ethan hesitated, but then he walked over, taking a seat beside him. They sat in silence for a long time before Logan finally spoke, his voice rough. "I guess you were right, Reed. About everything." Ethan glanced at him, seeing the uncertainty in his expression. He offered a small tentative smile. "It's not about being right, Logan. It's about making this place better for everyone." Logan nodded slowly, staring out at the courtyard where students gathered in groups, laughing and talking. Maybe I could try that too." Ethan didn't press him for more. He just sat beside Logan, watching the school they had both fought to change, and felt a sense of peace settle over him. Back at home, Jacob sat down with Ethan at the dinner table, looking over the acceptance letter from the local university that Ethan had received in the mail. "I'm proud of you, son," Jacob said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. "You've got a bright future ahead of you, and no matter what happens next, I want you to know that you made a difference." Ethan smiled, feeling the warmth of his father's pride. "I couldn't have done it without you, Dad. You taught me how to fight for what's right." As they sat together sharing a quiet meal, Jacob and Ethan felt a sense of hope for the future. They knew that their journey hadn't been easy, that the scars of their battle would linger, that there would always be challenges ahead. But they also knew that they had come through it stronger, more united than ever. And as the sun set over the town, casting the first warm glow of spring across the horizon, they looked forward to the new beginnings that awaited them both at Emerson Prep and beyond. This continuation brings the story to a conclusion, focusing on the aftermath of the struggle, the changes at Emerson Prep, and the personal growth of Jacob, Ethan, and the community around them. It ties up the main conflicts while leaving space for the characters to continue their journeys beyond the events of the story. If you have any more parts you'd like to explore, or would like to see additional details in the resolution, let me know. "You said, continue," ChatGPT said. "Certainly, let's move into the final part, Part 10, which will bring a sense of closure to all the arcs while showing the lasting impact of the struggles Jacob and Ethan faced. It will focus on the resolution of lingering issues, how Emerson Prep evolves, and where Jacob and Ethan find themselves after the dust has settled. This part will provide a heartfelt conclusion, offering a sense of triumph and hope for the future, while acknowledging the journey they took to get here. Part 10. Healing and Hope. Chapters 41-44, 13,000 words. Chapter 41. A New Order. 3,500 words. With Shaw officially removed from power and the investigation into his dealings ongoing, Emerson Prep found itself at a crossroads. The new advisory council, made up of parents, students, and a few dedicated teachers, met regularly to discuss the future of the school. For the first time, decisions were being made openly, with input from the whole community. Jacob became an integral part of this transformation. Though he continued to work his day job at the construction company, he volunteered his evenings to help shape the school's new direction. His straightforward approach and reputation as a fighter earned him respect, even among some of the families who had initially been wary of him. One evening, as the council gathered in the school's newly redecorated library, Jacob led a discussion on how to better support scholarship students like Ethan. Mr. Barrow, no longer the strict disciplinarian he once was, listened attentively, contributing his ideas for new programs that could bridge the gap between students of different backgrounds. "I've seen how much change is possible when we actually listen to each other," Barrow said, his tone more humble than it had ever been. "And I want to make sure that the mistakes I made never happen again." Jacob nodded, feeling a quiet satisfaction as he looked around the room at the people who had come together for a common purpose. He thought back to the early days of their fight, when he had felt so isolated and outmatched, and marveled at how much had changed. At the end of the meeting, Linda Martinez pulled Jacob aside with a grateful smile. "I can't thank you enough for everything you've done. My daughter feels like she actually belongs here now. You've given us all a chance to start fresh." Jacob smiled back, his heart swelling with a sense of accomplishment. I'm just glad we were able to make a difference. But we still have a lot of work to do. As he walked out of the school that evening, he spotted Ethan waiting for him by the truck. His son was leaning against the hood, his face lit up by the glow of the setting sun. "How'd the meeting go?" Dad Ethan asked. Jacob ruffled his hair, a smile tugging at his lips. "It went well, Ethan. Really well. I think we're finally starting to turn things around." Ethan's smile widened, and he climbed into the truck beside his father. For the first time in months, their drive home was filled with talk of the future, not the battles they had fought, but the possibilities that lay ahead. Chapter 42. Building Bridges, 3,000 Words. As Emerson Prep continued to adjust to its new leadership, Ethan found himself stepping into a new role as well. He was asked to join a student committee dedicated to making the school more inclusive, a role he never would have imagined for himself when he first walked through Emerson's imposing gates. The committee organized study groups, mentorship programs, and community events, encouraging students from different backgrounds to connect with one another. One Saturday morning, Ethan and Rachel stood in front of a group of middle school students, leading a workshop on study skills and preparation for high school. Rachel was in her element, explaining strategies with enthusiasm, while Ethan shared stories about his own challenges adjusting to Emerson's academic standards. After the workshop, one of the younger students, a shy girl with glasses named Lily, approached Ethan with a hesitant smile. "Thanks for helping me, Ethan," she said, clutching her notebook to her chest. "I was scared about starting here next year, but now, it doesn't seem so bad." Ethan's chest tightened with emotion, and he smiled back at her. "You're going to do great, Lily. And if you ever need help, you know where to find me." As the students filed out, Rachel turned to Ethan with a proud grin. "You're a natural at this, you know. I bet you'll end up running the place one day." Ethan blushed, but there was a new confidence in his voice when he answered. "I don't know about that, but it feels good helping people. I guess I learned that from my dad." Rachel's expression softened, and she reached out to squeeze his hand. "Well, I'm glad you're here, Ethan. You've changed this place more than you realize." Ethan glanced around the now-empty room, feeling a warmth spread through him. He thought of all the students who had once seen him as an outsider, and how many of them now saw him as a friend, or at least an equal. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, still old prejudices that lingered, but the progress they had made felt real. And for Ethan, that progress was enough to keep him going. Chapter 43. Shaw's Last Play, 3,500 Words. Despite the changes at Emerson Prep, Shaw hadn't given up. His legal appeals dragged on, and rumors swirled that he was planning a last-ditch effort to regain his influence over the school. He even filed a lawsuit against the school board, claiming that his removal had been illegal and demanding reinstatement. The tension came to a head at a school board hearing held to address Shaw's latest lawsuit. Jacob, Ethan, and their allies gathered outside the town courthouse, joined by dozens of parents, students, and teachers who had come to show their support for the new leadership at Emerson. Shaw arrived flanked by his lawyers, wearing his signature-tailored suit and a look of steely determination. He surveyed the crowd with disdain, clearly annoyed by the show of unity against him. As he walked past Jacob, he leaned in with a cold smile. "This isn't over, Reed. I'll get my school back, and when I do, you and your son will wish you never crossed me." Jacob met his gaze without flinching, his voice steady. "The only one who should be worried is you, Shaw. We're not afraid of you anymore." The hearing was tense, with Shaw's lawyers arguing that the board had acted without proper authority when they suspended him. But the tide had turned, and the board members, many of whom had once been under Shaw's thumb, now spoke openly about his abuses of power. Mr. Barrow, testifying on behalf of the new administration, recounted how Shaw had pressured him into targeting scholarship students, how he had used the school as a means to enrich himself. His testimony was followed by statements from parents and teachers who described the toxic atmosphere that Shaw had cultivated during his tenure. When it was Jacob's turn to speak, he addressed the board with a quiet determination. "This school doesn't belong to Gregory Shaw. It belongs to the students, the parents, and the community that believes in making it a better place. If we give him back control, we're undoing everything we've worked so hard to change." The board deliberated for several hours before finally reaching a decision. When they returned, the chairwoman announced that Shaw's lawsuit was dismissed and that the state would continue its investigation into his financial practices. Shaw's face turned ashen, and he stormed out of the courtroom without a word. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, a wide smile breaking across his face. He hugged his father tightly, feeling a rush of relief and pride. "We did it, Dad. We really did it. Jacob hugged him back, a tear slipping down his cheek as he murmured, "Yeah, Ethan. We did." Chapter 44. Moving Forward. 3,000 words. In the months that followed, Emerson Prep began to find its footing again. The investigation into Shaw's dealings led to formal charges, and he was ultimately banned from holding any position of influence over educational institutions in the state. It was a final, fitting end for a man who had once wielded so much power. But for Jacob and Ethan, the end of Shaw's influence was only the beginning of their new chapter. Jacob continued to serve on the advisory council, helping to shape policies that made the school more accessible to students from all walks of life. Ethan focused on his studies, thriving in a school that no longer felt like an enemy. The day Ethan graduated from Emerson Prep, the entire school gathered in the courtyard for the ceremony. As he crossed the stage to receive his diploma, the applause was louder than he had ever imagined. He spotted Rachel cheering in the front row alongside Mr. Barrow and Henry, and he felt a swell of gratitude for everyone who had helped him reach this moment. After the ceremony, Jacob hugged Ethan tightly, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you, son. You've faced down so much, and you came through stronger." Ethan hugged him back, a wide smile on his face. "I couldn't have done it without you, Dad. You taught me what it means to stand up for yourself, no matter how tough it gets." As they walked together through the school's gates one last time, Ethan paused, looking back at the building that had once been the source of so much pain. But now, he saw it as a place where he had found his voice, where he had built friendships and discovered his own strength. Jacob placed a hand on his son's shoulder, glancing back at the school with a smile. "Ready for whatever comes next?" Ethan nodded, his eyes bright with determination. "Yeah, Dad, I'm ready." And as they walked toward the future, side by side, they knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they had already faced the worst and come out stronger, together. Epilogue. Seeds of Change. 1,000 words. A year later, Emerson Prep had become a symbol of transformation in the town, a place where students of all backgrounds could find support and opportunity. The new scholarship program was thriving, and the school's mentorship initiative had become a model for others in the state. Mr. Barrow had stepped down from his temporary role as headmaster, making way for a new principal who embraced the spirit of change. Jacob had returned to his work full-time, but remained a trusted advisor to the school board. He and Henry continued to work with local families to ensure that the gains they had made wouldn't be undone. As for Ethan, he had earned a scholarship to a nearby university, where he planned to study social work, hoping to help kids like himself who struggled to find their place in the world. Rachel had joined him at the same school, and together, they dreamed of a future where every child could be treated with dignity. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jacob and Ethan sat together on their porch, looking out at the town that had once seemed so small. They didn't speak much, they didn't need to. The silence was filled with a sense of peace, of knowing that they had faced their battles head-on and come out stronger. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" Ethan asked softly, breaking the quiet. Jacob nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Every day, Ethan, and I wouldn't change a thing." As the stars began to twinkle in the sky, father and son sat together, knowing that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them with the same determination that had carried them through everything else. And in that moment, surrounded by the quiet of the evening, they knew that they had built something that would last, a legacy of hope, strength, and the power of standing up for what's right. This final part and epilogue wrap up the story, focusing on the resolution of Shaw's influence, the rebuilding of Emerson Prep, and the new paths Jacob and Ethan find for themselves. It emphasizes the lasting impact of their struggle, the friendships and alliances they've built, and the sense of hope that carries them into the future. If you'd like any adjustments or further details, let me know. Certainly here's a concluding paragraph with a call to subscribe, fitting the uplifting tone of the story. And that's the story of how a father and son faced impossible odds and turned a symbol of exclusion into a place of hope. If you were moved by Jacob and Ethan's journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our future stories. Together, we can keep sharing tales that inspire courage, hope, and the belief that even the smallest voices can make a big difference. Leave a comment and let us know. What would you fight for? See you in the next story. This call to subscribe wraps up the story while encouraging viewers to engage and share their own thoughts. Let me know if you'd like any other additions. Sure. Here's a brief and engaging introduction that summarizes the main events, teases some of the central conflicts, and includes a call to comment and subscribe. What would you do if the place you fought so hard to reach tried to push you out? In this emotional story, a humble father named Jacob and his son Ethan take on the elite world of Emerson Prep, a prestigious school where wealth and power rule. When Ethan earns a scholarship to Emerson, they believe it's a chance for a brighter future. But soon, Ethan becomes the target of relentless bullying and discrimination, while Jacob faces pressure from those who want them to disappear. But they refuse to back down. Together, they uncover a web of corruption, led by the powerful Gregory Shaw, who will stop at nothing to maintain his control over the school. As secrets unravel and tensions rise, Jacob and Ethan find unexpected allies and face devastating setbacks. Will they find a way to change the school's toxic culture, or will Shaw crush their hopes for good? Join us on this journey of resilience, courage, and the fight for justice. Like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay tuned for more powerful stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, if you were in Ethan's place, would you have the courage to keep fighting? Let us know your thoughts below. This introduction sets the stage for the story, highlights the key challenges, and leaves room for curiosity about how the conflict unfolds, encouraging viewers to engage and follow along. Let me know if you'd like any changes. When Ethan earns a scholarship to the prestigious Emerson Prep, he and his father, Jacob, believe it's the start of a new future. But they soon discover that the school's elitism runs deeper than they ever imagined. Faced with relentless bullying and a system that wants to push them out, Jacob and Ethan decide to fight back. They uncover a web of corruption led by Gregory Shaw, the powerful man pulling all the strings behind the scenes. With their home and future at stake, Jacob and Ethan push through devastating setbacks and risk everything to expose the truth. But Shaw won't go down without a fight, and he'll use every dirty trick in the book to keep control. Will this father and son duo bring justice to Emerson Prep, or will they be silenced forever? Watch their powerful journey of resilience and hope, and find out if they can change their world for the better. Like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more inspiring stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, would you have the courage to stand up against the powerful? This version is shorter and highlights the core of the story while keeping some mystery about the outcomes, inviting viewers to engage and follow along. Let me know what you think. When Ethan wins a scholarship to the prestigious Emerson Prep, he and his dad, Jacob, see it as a dream come true. But their hopes quickly fade when they face a world where wealth and power rule, and outsiders like them aren't welcome. As Ethan endures relentless bullying, Jacob discovers a deeper truth. Gregory Shaw, a powerful figure behind the school, is determined to push them out. Refusing to back down, Jacob and Ethan fight to expose Shaw's corruption, risking everything to bring justice to a place that desperately needs change. But with every step forward, Shaw fights back harder, and their struggle becomes a battle for more than just a place at Emerson. It's a fight for their dignity, their home, and their future. Can a father and son stand up to the powerful forces stacked against them and transform the school? Or will Shaw crush their hopes once and for all? Follow their gripping journey and see how far they'll go to stand up for what's right. Like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more stories of courage and resilience. And let us know in the comments, what would you do if you were in their shoes? This version is even more concise, highlighting the stakes and the mystery while encouraging viewers to engage and subscribe. Let me know if it fits what you had in mind.